The New York Times sucks. I don't think I'm saying anything particularly shocking to many of you out there, considering my very left-leaning audience. But for those of you who have not been following, the New York Times is a really terrible newspaper, mainstream newspaper. It, at the best of times, could be considered a moderate liberal newspaper. I would go so far as to say it's generally leaning quite often conservative, but it is a paper that very often legitimizes that moderate liberal stance of, things are going too far. Let's just return to the status quo. We dislike Trump, but those lefties they're just too far, too radical. We need to, have a conversation about abortion rights and trans rights and be okay to compromise on people being, not full people. I've talked about this numerous times for many, many years at this point. I think most recently I have done so focusing on Ezra Klein, who is a regular columnist and has a podcast called The Ezra Klein Show on the New York Times. Go check out that video on my main channel because it goes over the overall problem with centrist liberalism. On top of that, just specifically for what we're going to be talking about today, the New York Times has been heavily criticized for its very biased anti-trans reporting that it's been doing over the past few years. Very similar in context to what the BBC is doing over in the UK, presenting themselves as sort of a centrist moderate position, but often only fronting trans issues when it's a way to sort of create this misinformation around trans people. The New York Times has, for example, regularly platformed opinion writers who are talking about the danger of trans women entering into women's spaces, and yet very rarely will news articles talking about the actual science behind gender-affirming care, trans-affirming care, and how it actually can be very beneficial and helpful. So it starts to propagandize that anti-trans view as a moderate liberal position, which is incredibly dangerous, as we are seeing in the UK, which scarily seems like it's basically a look into the future of where trans rights are going to be in the United States in just a few years. We are facing, obviously, very heavy attacks from conservatives like Trump, but that position is being pushed further and further into the liberal space. And the New York Times is a big part of the mainstream push for those kind of views into a sort of moderate liberal stance. But for today, I actually want to focus in on another podcast on the New York Times, one called Interesting Times, hosted by Ross Douthat, another opinion writer, sort of Ezra Klein's more conservative-leaning twin on the New York Times, for lack of a better comparison. And the reason I want to talk about this podcast in particular is because Ross was interviewing a transgender activist, Chase Strangio, who many people may know as the first ever transgender lawyer to argue a case in front of the Supreme Court. And I don't know why I chose to listen to this podcast. I guess I generally try to stay up to date, at least on how mainstream folks talk about transgender people. So I did end up listening to this podcast, just thinking I would just listen to it and, get over it. But listening to it just boiled my blood so much. Like, do you ever have those experiences where you can literally feel your blood pressure rising? Like, I can feel it in my wrist, like, oh my God, I'm going to have like a heart attack listening to this thing. And I just needed to vent it somewhere and share my pain with all of you, or else I would have to be going to visit the doctors. This is my therapy, everybody. But the reason I wanted to talk about this podcast in particular is for two reasons. The first of which is Ross, as an interviewer, kind of represents what I was talking about a few moments ago, how the New York Times is very insidiously pushing this anti-trans narrative. And listening to the podcast, there's so many ways that he pushed these presumptions and assumptions and narratives around the trans community in a very subtle way that I found is worth talking about, so that all of you can sort of be aware of it. Because if you just listen to this podcast, it comes across as like a very nuanced, thoughtful conversation between two people. But at the end of the day, Ross is really pushing very anti-trans views in a very moderate sort of way. And I want to kind of break that down. But the other thing that I want to touch upon here is actually Chase's response to Ross's presentation of these issues, because I think it is actually very fascinating how Chase responds to these situations. And me listening, I'm like, I see what you're trying to do here, Chase, and you have the patience of a saint dealing with this stuff. But ultimately, why even Chase trying to engage on this conversation is ultimately going to just help anti-trans views. And I really wanted to kind of break that down a little bit here. So you're going to have to go along with me for this ride. So this video is going to be basically a cut down of a recent live stream where I went over the podcast, but we're going to start off by looking at our two players in this podcast, Ross and Chase. So enjoy? I don't know if enjoy is the right word, but enjoy, I guess. So ultimately, the point I'm making here with Ross is like, I actually kind of liked Ross. Like I didn't think he was great. I hadn't really watched his work. But I was like, okay, at least he's like pushing back on some of these like ideas. But then I sort of looked into him more, and just to give the clarification of who Ross is as we enter into this conversation, Ross is a conservative, and actually a conservative Catholic. He is converted to Catholicism. Like, I'm just using the Wikipedia pages. There's better sources for this. I'm just using this for a quick example here. But Ross is able to articulate a lot of these things towards Ezra Klein and even Tony Gilroy, because he is like coming at it from like a conservative point of view and being very critical of like liberal establishments, but he is in that same sort of bucket. I would even place him in a very similar bucket as like Ezra Klein, right? Like he identifies as a conservative, and he identifies as like a Catholic, like conservative guy. But I would put him in the same bucket as like Ezra Klein, in the sense that he's like a moderate. He's like Ezra Klein's like mirror image as at the New York Times, of they both sort of have this like, all right, Trump is ridiculous, the left-wing radicals are ridiculous, let's just get back to normal politics. And that sort of like moderate centrist stance. And they both kind of have a very similar view on that. So I kind of came into this podcast that he had with Chase, who I want to talk about in a second too, before we actually get into listening to this. Chase Strangio, apologies if I say his name wrong, being like, okay, so I already know to expect like this like moderate, like liberal, centrist, conservative position of like, we're just asking questions, we want to reassert like the norms, and it's a telling place for me, and this is kind of what I want to talk about this podcast for, of like where the conversation that centrists want to push conversations on trans rights to. And so coming into this conversation, I think it's very fascinating to see where Ross is articulating his point of view on trans rights, because ultimately, as you're going to see, it's going to get your blood boiling as we go through this, because it got my blood boiling, and this is why I needed to vent about it on a stream. Oh, thank you, Son of Dionysus. I'll respond to that in a second. Just let me make this point, and then I'll be excited to talk about that. His ultimate point is he wants to try to normalize a lot of like the anti-trans rhetoric that we've seen. So what he's going to do, as you're going to see throughout this podcast, is sort of take the like extreme Trumpian position and then sort of place it into this centrist language of like, I'm just asking questions. What do you think, Chase? And like forcing Chase to respond to these questions of like, oh, don't you think it's ridiculous that like the trans activists think this way? And Sunny Dionysus, heart to you. Thank you so much for the super chat. You said, I still think about identities a lot. Thank you so much for making, oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I'm really glad because, and actually I won't say too much today, but there have been chats of figuring out how to continue identities in some way, in recent days. I can't say too much about that, but I am very excited about still identities and some other things I'm working on. So just thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And I appreciate you. And I'm very excited. I adore identities, and I want to make more of it so much. I want to make more of it so much. Actually, I don't know if you can, I have my photo on this wall. I'll show it some other time, maybe at the end of the stream without moving my camera. I have my identities poster right there. Yeah, I can't speak about exactly what I'm planning to do for identities, because I don't want to curse it in some way, but hopefully we'd be able to do more identities in some form. But we'll see. Anyways, I want to quick talk about Chase, and then we actually should get into this so that this stream doesn't go for like 10 hours. So Chase appears on this podcast. For those of you who don't know, Chase is a ACLU lawyer who is a transgender activist who is he's the first, and as Ross will get into in the podcast, we'll save going into the detail on it for that. But Chase has argued 2 cases in front of the Supreme Court. First trans person to argue in front of the Supreme Court, did 2. Won the first one, I think in 2022, and then lost the second one, I think in 2024. I believe those are the dates. We'll get into the nitty gritty of both, but obviously the one that he lost was the one when the court has shifted more conservative. I think I might be getting the dates wrong, but essentially, like, it was a more liberal-leaning court and then became more conservative, as the Supreme Court has under over the past few years, and as a result, resulted in the second loss. Now, what's interesting about Chase and why I particularly find Chase to be a really interesting figure is, at least from my research, I have heard mixed things, but at least from what I can tell, Chase, like I said, is a lawyer. A trans lawyer. So he is in this weird position, right? Where when he argues for trans rights, what he has to essentially do is he has to argue for defending transgender rights under the laws that exist. He is not a lawmaker. He just has to argue for interpretation of the law. So a lot of his arguments that he's had to make in public and in front of the Supreme Court is sort of like acquiescing or trying to slot a discussion around transgender rights into an existing law framework. As we'll sort of see with Ross here, the first conversation, the first battle that, we'll get into it in the podcast, but essentially, like, that's his position. He's arguing for rights under the laws as they currently exist in their own language. And I have a lot of respect for that, as compared to someone who I've been very critical of, Representative Sarah McBride, trans senator, I keep saying senator, Congresswoman, from Delaware. And I've been very critical of Sarah McBride because she is often arguing for, like, oh, trans rights have gone too far. We just need to, concede on some issues. We need to, like, be willing to, like, concede on some trans rights issues. She's not willing to stand up for her own rights and personhood when, you have literally the Speaker of the House being like, you're not really a woman. You need to use the men's bathroom, and instituting laws against Nancy Mace and all of that shit. And on the surface, though, Chase and Sarah would ultimately have to make similar arguments based on, like, following the law. But the reason I have a lot of respect for someone like Chase versus someone like Sarah McBride is that Sarah McBride is a lawmaker. She should be the one being like, this is what I want my rights to be. These are the points of view that I have. And then maybe be willing to compromise on them to get, like, some rights, like, right now, like some bill rights, like conversations right now to sort of, like, get something for people. But being very clear on what she wants up front and saying, this is what I want. Not trying to, contort her views to sort of be what she thinks is going to be the most popular. And that's why I have a lot of criticism for McBride, because she should be trying to fight for these rights and maybe compromising as she needs to get something on the law books, but at least being very clear on what she wants. Whereas a lot of the time, and I talked about this in my recent video, she will often compromise before the fact and say, like, oh, well, I'm already going to compromise on my rights here just so I can try to appear like one of the good ones, to have, like, a conversation across the aisle with bad faith actors, because the Republicans are not good, especially on the federal level, are not good faith actors. They are using this trans people as a scapegoat. So I'm very critical of someone like Sarah McBride, where I am very, like, I have a lot more respect for someone like Chase, because Chase is basically trying to interpret the law to basically try to get protections for trans people as best he can as a lawyer right now through winning cases, and has a very material focus on that. And I really appreciate that. And actually what's very interesting about Chase, as I think is going to be very interesting in this conversation, what I wanted to bring it up, and this is why I think this is a very interesting conversation. This is actually the thing I find the most interesting thing about this conversation to me, is that Chase is actually a very, very, if you actually know Chase's views, he has actually been very clear that he has very, very radical views on trans issues. In fact, let me go to this one here. Like, Chase, again, I'm using Wikipedia. There are better ways to find information, but this is just a good primer for our conversation here. Chase described himself as a constitutional lawyer who fundamentally doesn't believe in the Constitution. Like, Chase is very anti-assimilationist in his views if you listen to a lot of what he actually talks about in his sort of his day-to-day perspective. Like here, this is a post that Chase put up a few years ago where he literally calls, like, I believe in many ways the mainstream LGBTQ legal movement caused significant harm in further entrenching the institution of marriage as an organizing structure of U.S. civil society. That said, I also found movements of joy in witnessing the post-Obergefell celebration, in which people celebrate their queer love and recognize that many people, myself included, marriage rights afforded the needed material benefits. So what Chase is arguing here, and I think this is a very controversial, this is an opinion that I agree with, and I even say this as someone who myself is getting married. You know, I have a partner, but like, what he's basically articulating here is the very anti-assimilationist point of view that many trans people, many people in the queer community have. Because after the 1980s, essentially, you had the AIDS movement, like the ACT UP movement fighting against like the abandonment of queer people under AIDS. You also had Stonewall earlier than that. And these were very much movements of like anti-assimilation, fuck the man, fuck the police sort of attitudes that were in the queer community of like, hey, we're pushing back against these institutions. Yeah, it's very, very based, right? And so a very, very like fuck the man, anti-assimilationist mindset within the queer community. But then in recent years, in like once we get into like the Bill Clinton era, there became the shift in queer movements to want to assimilate. So saying like fight for adoption rights, of being able to like raise kids and have a quote unquote normal family, like your Pete Buttigieg's of like, I'm gonna adopt a kid and have like a heteronormative style marriage just with a guy instead of a woman, but still sort of assimilating to that sort of like 2.5 kids lifestyle. Fighting for marriage equality, and even more importantly, fighting for, more tellingly, I should say, fighting for like access to being able to fight in the military. Like, oh, we're fighting for like don't ask, don't tell, and the repeal of ask, don't tell, like to openly fight in the military, to be able to fight in the American imperialist machine. Now, I'm not saying that people shouldn't have these rights. We should be treated equally under the law, for sure. But the focus became on that inclusion. Whereas, you know, there was a much more like radical movement within the queer community before then that still existed, especially in, you know, communities of color within the queer community, was still very anti-assimilationist. But a lot of like white folks within the queer community were starting to push for more assimilation. And again, there's overlap and it's not all one thing, but like this is the general trend. So Chase, personally, seems to have, at least from what I can tell, extremely like anti-assimilationist views, saying literally I don't even agree with the Constitution, and sort of understands like the oppressive nature of like United States as an institution against marginalized folks, just baked into it. But as a lawyer, has to argue this position of, okay, what are our rights that I can get to under the law? Which puts him in this very weird position that we are going to see very clearly in this podcast as we go through it. And I'm going to go through it now. Finally, I'll get to it after like, we've been going for an hour. Getting into this podcast. And what I found very fascinating about this conversation is what you're going to see Chase doing here is like Ross is going to present these questions, these very leading questions of trying to normalize anti-trans rhetoric. And Chase is, you can see Chase, like the calculation going on in Chase's mind, I can almost feel. And I was like listening to this, I'm like, I can almost hear the gears moving, of like Chase being like, all right, here's the law, here's like the normie perspective that I know I should argue against something like this to like get people to understand me, but then also seeing like Chase make these like offhanded asides of like, well, this is what I actually believe, but you aren't ready for that, Ross. And it's ultimately why, once we get to the end of this, I think you'll see my kind of point of like, I feel like this was a bad move on Chase's part. Like Chase is doing, for those of you who don't know, he's doing a sort of like publicity rounds right now because there's a documentary about him and his fights in the Supreme Court called Heightened Scrutiny, I think is what it's called. Yeah, Heightened Scrutiny. And I'm very excited to see the movie. So he's been appearing on a bunch of different podcasts and stuff, and I really wish he had not appeared on the New York Times because I understand his interest in wanting to do so. And I get it. It's like you want to try and have these arguments and like, look, I'm a radical person. I can push these things here. But ultimately, at the end of the day, what Ross's project is going to ultimately try and do is paint trans people as ridiculous. And like Chase is trying to navigate these two ideas of like, how do I present this in a way that's going to make people who watch this podcast, a more centrist audience, understand the trans perspective, which I think is admirable, but also being like, I have to translate it into like normie speak, I guess for the lack of a better word, that ultimately is going to serve Ross, because Ross is going to be able to pick apart, like, well, these two things, you're contradicting yourself. And it's not really a contradiction if you actually understand trans issues, but you understand, like, the battle that Chase is trying to kind of put himself in, and something that Ross is ultimately going to be able to take advantage of in the conversation. Now that we set the frame here, let's get into this. Again, for a warning, the reason I wanted to do this stream was because I started watching it and felt like I felt my blood pressure rising as we got progressively into it. So let's get into it. We'll break it down as we go. I'm just gonna play it and I'll pause it as we go. So apologies that you're gonna get into this. So this is just the intro here.
What actually defines transgender identity?
Transgender!
Are transgender rights still the next frontier of civil rights?
Effective immediately, transgender Americans may serve openly.
The New Zealand weightlifter Laurel Hubbard is set to become the first transgender athlete to compete at the Olympics.
Catalina Enriquez made history as the first openly transgender woman to win the competition.
Or are they the place where social liberalism has finally hit a limit? And is peace available in this culture war? Or is the chasm just too wide? My guest today...
So already we can see, maybe, oh yeah, let me put the captions on for everybody. So already we can already see Ross's framing here. It's already framing, like, the conversation around the culture war topic. It's not oh, I'm going to have a conversation with a trans person about trans rights, trans issues. It's now like, no, this trans person is going to have to, like, be engaged in the culture war discourse, right? And he is presenting himself as, like, a neutral arbiter in this, right? This is what centrists always do. Ezra Klein does the same exact thing. Is he is presenting himself as, like, well, I'm just, like, trying to navigate this culture war. But already by presenting this frame of, like, we're not just going to talk to a trans person on trans person's terms, they now have to, like, address all of this bullshit that's coming up. Like, he even shows, like, pictures of, like, trans people in sports, and J.K. Rowling, like, these are framed as legitimate, like, just concerns that we have to engage with rather than bad faith attacks against trans people. You've already set the conversation at that tone. And he is presenting himself within this as just asking questions, neutral arbiter. And it's the thing that I'm very, very frustrated about with moderates and how it normalizes these things. Where, like, you see this over and over again. Pete Buttigieg does even the same thing where it's just like, well, you know, people just have understandable concerns about trans people in sports, understandable concerns about, like, trans people in, you know, women's spaces, whatever, right? And they present themselves like, oh, I don't really have an opinion. But they are normalizing that as a place to have the conversation on, rather than actually presenting what the actual issues are facing trans people, like about gender affirming care access and stuff like that. So we'll get there. Yes, exactly. Sarah, you say subtext justify your existence to me.
Is a lawyer for the ACLU, a trans rights activist, and the first transgender person to argue a case before the Supreme Court. Chase Strangio, welcome to Interesting Times.
Strangio.
Thank you for having me, Ross.
It's a pleasure. So
again, let me know if I need to
talk
adjust
about where the fight over
levels.
transgender rights is going. We're going to try and get into some deeper philosophical waters. We'll see how that goes. But I want to start with your own legal work, because you were a lawyer on two, right, of the biggest Supreme Court cases.
So yeah, this is what I was talking about.
Rights. One and two.
This was Chase's two cases. This is why I didn't want to go too much into them, because I know it's going to be brought up here, and I think it'll be interesting how Chase responds.
2020 here, right? And one in 2024, right?
Correct.
Yes.
Yes.
And so in the first case, you were on the winning side. In the second one, you lost. Both were 6-3 decisions. And so I thought we'd start by just having you talk through both of those cases as a way of grounding our conversation. So the first one is Bostock versus Clayton County. What did that case ask the Supreme Court to decide?
Yeah, so Bostock versus Clayton County, Georgia, was actually 3 cases that came up to the Supreme Court together. And the facts in those cases were simply that 2 gay men were fired from their jobs when their employer learned that they were gay, and 1 transgender woman was fired from her job when her employer learned that she was trans. And by the time the cases got to the Supreme Court, the only question was whether or not Title VII's prohibition on sex discrimination, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, included prohibitions on discrimination in employment because someone is gay or transgender.
All right, we're going to get onto this point in just a second.
Court, it was a question of pure law of whether the Title VII covered discrimination against LGBT people. And our argument was that it is sex discrimination to fire someone for being gay or to fire someone for being transgender. And the argument went, if a man comes to work and says that he married Mary over the weekend, and that's totally fine. But if a woman comes to work and said she married Mary over the weekend and is fired, it's but for their sex that the firing took place. That is a form of sex discrimination prohibited by the statute.
Okay, so this is a really, really important point, and this is kind of what I was getting to when I was talking about Chase's position as a lawyer, right? Because the case here was essentially arguing, like, discrimination against a trans woman, firing a trans woman for showing up, like saying I'm trans, this is how I identify. She was fired. I believe it was a funeral worker. She was working at a funeral home and they fired her. And essentially, he had to argue under Title VII, I think it was, that this was discrimination based on sex. And that is very important because it's discrimination based on sex, not gender, because the law does not say, it does not protect discrimination based on gender. The word gender does not appear in the law. When normally, if we are talking about discrimination against trans people, we'd be talking about, like, you are discriminated against because of your gender identity. That a trans person identifies as a gender other than the one they were assigned at birth, and because they identify with a different gender, not necessarily as different, like, some trans people, like, will want to change elements of their sex characteristics, like myself. Like, I've had breast augmentation, I've had vaginoplasty, so, like, I have changed parts of my biological sex, and it is very mutable. But ultimately, like, the mainstream understanding about transgender issues is that we are talking about we're talking about gender identity and focusing on, like, how someone identifies differently than their gender assigned at birth, not necessarily their sex, which in mainstream understanding, again, people understand sex as just like XX and XY chromosomes, like very, very binary view of sex, when sex itself is also very much a spectrum in many different ways in how we understand and define sex. So what Chase is ultimately having to do here within the law is that you need to, basically he's arguing that, like, this discrimination against this trans person was based on her sex, not her gender identity. And that is a very particular, like, way that you have to argue it, because the law doesn't protect discrimination based on gender identity. It protects based on sex, which is very different. Is a very different thing. They're related, but they are different. And it's not necessarily how we would conceive nor want to argue for protection of trans people. Like, we would want to have a law in the books that protects people based on gender identity and sex, both of those things. But the law doesn't. And as a result, this is the argument that Chase has to make. So this is kind of the interesting, like, legal hoops that someone like Chase has to jump through as a lawyer. And you will see how, like, this gets into the conversation here as he's describing.
With transgender status, if an employer says, everyone named Mary, come to my office, and there's 4 Marys at the office, and then they say, Mary, who had a birth assigned sex of male,
Mary had a little lamb.
Because you can't come to work as Mary. And the argument was, it was because of sex. That is prohibited under the plain language of Title VII. And in a 6-3 ruling written by Justice Gorsuch, the court ruled in...
Yeah, to be clear, Starbush 69, as you say, both sex and gender are social constructs. As much as people would like you to think is different. Like, people's like, well, you know, gender may be malleable, but, like, sex is real. And it's binary, XXXY. Like, no, and I've done a whole video on this if you want my deeper opinions on this. But, like, sex itself is how we determine sex is based on numerous different things. And actually, I'm going to I'll save the conversation because Chase will actually get into it in just a minute, and it'll be interesting Ross's response to that. But, like, Chase will actually literally say this. So
favor of the employees who had been fired.
And so Gorsuch and John Roberts, right, both joined the decision. So it was the 4 liberal justices who you would expect to be sympathetic to those arguments, and then the two conservative or right-leaning justices. Why do you think they both joined, and Gorsuch obviously wrote the decision.
Yeah, so we litigated that case using a straightforward textualist theory that we thought would appeal to Justice Gorsuch, who is an avowed textualist, and that went basically...
This is exactly what I was talking about. Like, I'm going to just keep this going right here. Like, basically, like what I said, like, they are arguing the text of the law. Like, he was basically arguing to the Supreme Court the text of the law. Not necessarily arguing for how we would normally argue for transgender-based issues, like saying, hey, we shouldn't discriminate against someone because they're trans. He can't do that. He has to go by what the law says, and the law says we can't discriminate someone based on sex. So he can't argue because she's trans, she was discriminated against. It's like, no, you have to argue from her, her quote-unquote biological sex, is how he had to do it. And so that's why he's saying he was arguing from a textualist base, not necessarily like what the intent of the law was, but what the literal text of the law says. And a lot of like older conservative lawyers are very textualist. So a lot of like the older conservative judges at that time, I think Gorsuch is what he said, they're textualists. I mean, they don't necessarily care what the intent of the law is. They go by what the literal text of it is and how we interpret the text of the law. Whereas some lawyers, especially as you will see, sort of like a lot of like newer lawyers, or not lawyers, judges, excuse me, I keep saying judges. A lot of newer judges will argue for intent, or they'll interpret it based on intent. That will usually, because the laws are older, be like, well, we don't include trans people. We want to, like, focusing on these sort of more normative ideas. So it's an interesting sort of thing that he's doing here. Oh yeah, we'll get to that AF, Chris. There's a more overt moment where Ross like shares his hand, as you're saying there.
Ended in 1964 in terms of the applications of the law. What matters is the words that they used.
As I was just saying.
They said, no employment discrimination because of sex. And as commentators have often talked about with respect to this case, the shadow justice in the case, who was obviously not in the case because he had died, was Justice Scalia, because both the majority and the dissent were trying to channel who was approaching this case most like Justice Scalia. And Justice Scalia had written a famous opinion called On Call, in which he had said that same-sex sexual harassment is prohibited by Title VII, even if that was not one of the intended consequences when Congress passed Title VII in 1964. And so our argument was, look at the words of the statute. No discrimination because of sex. You don't have to decide what sex means. That was not what the case was about. We said, whatever definition you want of sex, the answer still holds that these individual employees were fired because of their sex. And I think that appealed to a textualist approach to legal interpretation. Justice Gorsuch went through methodically the Supreme Court's cases interpreting Title VII, and this fit, I think, squarely within it.
Just to stay with the
So this is exactly what I said, like arguing, like, you don't even need to worry about the trans aspect of this. Like, this person was discriminated based on their sex, so don't even need to worry about being trans. Like, you just need to look at the sex aspect. And because they wouldn't have done this to someone who was seen as a woman, and like who had a biological female sex, whatever, however you want to determine how sex is, because they wouldn't have done this to that person, then this is discrimination based on sex. You don't even look to the trans aspect of it. But like, if you had a person who was seen as a biological male show up in a dress, and a person who was seen as a biological female, quote unquote, I'm using quote unquotes here to simplify, biological female, because sex is also its own whole thing, show up in a dress, and like, one is trans, one is not, but that doesn't even matter, and you say, like, we're gonna fire the person we see as a boy wearing a dress, then that's discrimination based on sex, regardless of whether they are trans or not. That's basically the argument that Chase has to make under the law.
The sort of would-be textualist decision. In the case of the transgender person, right, it's the idea in that argument that the court accepted is that someone who is born biologically male,
quote-unquote biologically male,
and
Ross isn't saying
goes to
quote-unquote
work
biologically male, I am,
and presents as female, is being discriminated against because someone who is born as a biological female could present as female with no issue. What essential, like, manifestations of transgender identity are covered?
Well, I mean, in a sense,
Agreed, David Money.
It's not even necessarily hinged to transgender identity. What it's hinged to is, can you do something
exactly what I was saying.
that
Yep.
someone of a different sex could not do?
Right.
And so it could be, if I wanted to go to the ACLU and say, I'm Chase, and the ACLU says no because you were assigned female at birth, but someone assigned male at birth could come to the ACLU as Chase, that would also be an example of sex discrimination prohibited by Title VII. I don't have to declare a transgender identity for this logic to apply. In Amy's case, the case that was at the Supreme Court, she in essence had worked for this
Yes, so this is
funeral
basically
home for
exactly what I
many
was talking about.
years
Like,
and had
he is
written a
basically
letter
arguing
saying, this is who I am.
He was basically arguing, like, doesn't matter that they're trans, this is discrimination based on sex, and this person happens to have been trans in this case, but we are arguing for rights based on sex discrimination. So it's a very important point, and I think this is why I have respect for someone like Chase doing this work of, like, that's a very good way to get a material benefit for his client today, right now. Whereas, again, someone like Sarah McBride should be arguing for the law, like to create a law that would protect gender-based discrimination, protect against gender-based discrimination. So, like, Sarah McBride should be arguing, like, we should make a gender-based discrimination law, whereas Chase is, like, arguing, like, okay, here's the law, here's a way to try to argue it to the courts to be able to get material benefit for my transgender client.
She didn't say she was transgender, and she had said, I want to come to work looking less like a traditional man, and they said, well, you can't do that because of X. I think that also articulates a theory of sex discrimination that Title VII recognizes. So it wasn't actually hinged to sexual orientation or transgender status as such. It was just recognizing that in the circumstances before the court, the individuals were fired because of their sex.
All right, now let's go forward and talk about United States versus Skrmetti, which was argued last year and decided just this year.
This is the moment that I wanted to point out here.
This was presented to a slightly different but similarly divided Supreme Court. It was a challenge to Tennessee's ban on certain forms of care, what gets called gender-affirming care for transgender adolescents. What was the argument before the court there?
Yeah, so as you note,
So this is the one that Chase lost. This is there's a moment that's going to come up in just a second where Ross is going to show his hand very early here. We'll get to it in a second. But this is the one that Chase lost about, like, arguing for gender affirming care for minors. So.
It's puberty blockers and hormone therapies only when they're prescribed to treat gender dysphoria and transgender adolescents. And if I could just take, like, a brief moment to say what gender dysphoria is, just because I think that can be helpful for understanding the case, since we have both the legal doctrine and then the science that's underpinning a lot of it. So gender dysphoria is a condition.
So again, this is Chase, and this is where things are going to end up going off the rail. This is like the first kernel of it. It doesn't get as bad here, but Chase is trying to be like, all right, here's the legal stuff, and then let me try to explain some of these terms. And he is doing them in a way that is trying to, like, simplify it for an audience that someone like Ross's moderate audience would understand, quote unquote. And ultimately, it's going to provide inroads for Ross to sort of try to poke holes in Chase's argument, because Chase is trying to explain this both through a legal framework in a way that he has had to argue it to an audience that is not aware of transgender issues. So.
Condition that is characterized by...
AF Chris, you're talking about, meanwhile, I'm sure Ross will be fine with conversion therapy. Don't worry, we'll get there.
Clinically significant distress
we will get there.
That flows from the discordance between a person's gender identity, so the core of their understanding of their gender and their sex assigned at birth. And one of the ways that this condition is treated is through medical interventions that aim to minimize that very serious distress. And when minors are treated with these medications, it is done with the consent of their parents and the recommendation of their doctors. And so in Tennessee, these were medications that were available to treat gender dysphoria in both adults and adolescents. Tennessee passes a law that categorically bans these medications, and that leaves families like our ultimate clients in the case without access to medical care in their home state
Yes. Do we get into you don't have to be trans to experience gender dysphoria? Yes. But again, this is where Gator NATO, I love your name, Gator NATO, as you were already pointing out here, like the way that Chase is arguing this, because the case in front of the court is about gender-affirming care for minors, and gender-affirming care is seen as a treatment of a medicalized thing called gender dysphoria. But to be trans, you do not need gender dysphoria. It is not necessarily a thing that is required to be trans or to even seek some level of medical intervention. However, because we live in a medicalized society where being trans has to be medicalized in order to get any level of medical care justified under insurance and getting it all paid, we had to make these medicalizing arguments. And that's what Chase is trying to describe here without getting into all the other stuff about like, well, trans can be many different things. It doesn't necessarily just require dysphoria. But because he's not doing that and he has to make this argument to present to both a court, but as now he's presenting to Ross's audience, describing the court case, it's going to create those inroads as we were talking about in just a second. So again, this is exactly what we were just talking about
for their minor children, and
I agree, Sarah. I would like
Tennessee,
that as well.
And we made two legal arguments. The first was that these bans on medical treatment, because they hinged the prohibition on the medication on an individual's sex, violated the equal protection rights of transgender adolescents. So a similar argument to the one that we were talking about with respect to Boston.
So yeah, same exact thing here, as I was saying. Like sex, they're arguing for like this is discrimination based on sex. Not gender, not anything else, but based on sex.
On behalf of the parents, that these laws infringed upon the fundamental...
Oh, yes. Gator NATO. Cis people can definitely experience gender dysphoria. I think the most obvious example of that are all these groups like arguing like, men, you should take more testosterone. Get these testosterone pills. You know, fix your balding. Like, that's gender dysphoria that cisgender men feel around their gender. And they seek gender-affirming care, whether it be injecting themselves with more testosterone or, you know, getting like hair transplants, whatever. That's gender-affirming care. It's just cisgender men to make them appear more aligned with their masculine gender identity that they want to present as. And also, obviously, cultural examples of that, too, of putting these anxieties within cisgender men, that they should present this way, Like, all of these things are social constructs and influencing each other. Yes. But yes, everyone can experience gender dysphoria. In fact, I would argue most people, especially in our society that instills these sort of very rigid gender norms that no one can ever live up to, I think a lot of people, pretty much almost everyone, experiences some level of gender dysphoria and seeks some level of gender affirming care. But obviously when it's targeted at trans kids, people who are overtly identifying as trans, then it's going to be discriminated against, which is the argument that essentially Chase is argued in the case, was that like, okay, and I think you'll mention this in a second, it's like you would give these puberty blocking drugs to a non-transgender child for, you know, health reasons, but when it's a transgender kid, then you're going to block it. So.
Rights of parents to direct the medical care of their minor children. And this would be a right that is found in the substantive component of the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. And those were the two claims that were raised in that case. By the time it got to the Supreme Court and what would become United States v. Scrimetti, only the equal protection claim was before the court.
Just to be clear, when we're talking about care, in this case, for gender dysphoria, we are specifically talking about drugs that delay or halt puberty.
Yeah, so the pubertal suppressants, so the medications
puberty
that halt
blockers,
puberty,
that's right.
After the onset of puberty, and then hormone therapy. So after, whether it's a 16 or a 17-year-old who is then receiving hormone therapy to undergo either a typical male or typical female hormonal puberty. And those were the two sets of medications that were at issue in the case. And the way the Tennessee statute drafted the prohibition was to say that medications like these can be prescribed only when they are consistent with sex.
So this is the argument that I was just saying.
Our argument was focusing on that language as a sex classification under the Equal Protection Clause.
Right. And you lost.
We did.
So, and you lost the two justices.
So I think this is where Ross is going to show his hand here.
And join the decision.
In a very important way. That's going to spiral this whole conversation.
I guess, can you gloss in a completely fair and even-handed way why they ruled the way they did?
Okay. it's subtle, and it's not the biggest thing, but it will be very telling for where we're going to eventually go here. Oh, Leon, thank you so much. Oh, heart to you. I appreciate you. Mwah. Thank you so much for the super chat. And just to say how much I love your kind to the kind. Oh, you are wonderful. Mwah. Appreciate you. That's super, super nice. I'm going to give it a little heart. Yay. Okay. This is new. I haven't streamed in a while, so I'm like, oh, I didn't even know I could give it a heart. That's wonderful. Yay. Thank you very much. So Ross, this is a very, very subtle thing right here. That Ross did. Where Ross said, can you describe this in a fair and even-handed way? Now, on the surface, that just feels like, hey, you're the lawyer in this case, can you just describe why you lost, da-da-da-da-da? But what it eventually tells, and I think it's, again, very telling. Yep, see, no pun included, said a fair and even-handed way. Like, A, what is a completely fair and even-handed way? Also, he's the lawyer in the case. He's going to have his perspective on it. But what Ross is subtly doing here is saying, like, well, can you do this in a way that's not going to be tainted by your transgender bias? And there's that implication that being trans is inherently biased, is inherently over-emotional, over-invested, and what we really seek is to be above it all, to not be invested. And obviously that position is itself a political act. To say you're doing this apolitically is itself political. Who decides what's apolitical? What perspective do we assign as apolitical? Whose position are we looking at? And it's a very subtle thing here, but it's not a way. I would bet you that if it was a cis lawyer talking about a different case, he would not have phrased it that way. And it's a very telling moment. It's a subtle, and if it had just been that in this whole podcast, this would be it. But this is my first tell when I was watching this podcast, like, I see with what we're dealing with here. And it will spiral out, as you will see. So,
yeah, I mean, so I guess I want to say first that it was a really hard decision to decide what to do here when we lost at the appeals court.
Yep.
The reality for our clients was devastating. These were parents who had watched their kids suffer, who then had found a medication that was helping them. And I think everyone in the case agreed that this was a context in which there are kids suffering. And so then the disagreement is, well, what do you do about it? And the parents in this case, our clients.
Jojo, the podcast is really that we will get this is. I know we're 12 minutes into this. I did want to get into this. Hopefully this won't take the whole 3 hours to get through because I wanted to get to more important stuff. But I feel like this is very it's very telling, this whole podcast to me. It will go very off the rails in just a little bit.
They worked with their doctors. They learned a lot about the condition. They waited years in many cases before doing any interventions. And so we were watching healthcare be taken away from families across the country. And at the same time, we were looking at options.
And I think this is the reason I wanted to show this part of this is because it's a very telling part of what Chase is having to do here, right? Chase is having to argue from a legal framework. And he is being asked to argue the legal framework first. Ross is being tell me about the legal arguments that you're arguing on. And those arguments are not the arguments that a trans activist arguing for trans rights would make. But again, because Chase is a lawyer, having to make these arguments within a law environment, which I respect him for, it's presenting it in a way that I think will be allows inroads for what Ross is going to eventually do to present how he views trans activism and trans rights.
Even if you think there's a justification for this ban, you should agree with us that it's based on sex. Because unlike in Title VII, there's a two-part inquiry. So this was under the Equal Protection Clause because it was the government. The first part is, what is the basis by which the government is making a distinction? Is it based on sex or is it based on something else? And if it's based on sex, then it just means the government has to carry their burden to show that that use of sex is justified. And this is what's called the levels of scrutiny under the Equal Protection Clause. So our main argument to the court was, you don't have to decide if Tennessee's law is constitutional or unconstitutional, but we want you to reverse the lower court's decision that it wasn't based on sex.
Again, just arguing the legal framework to get these kids gender-affirming care, which is what the ultimate goal was.
And the reason that they held that the law was not based on sex was that they thought that it was a classification based on medical use, which we wouldn't dispute that it is also a classification based on. Yeah,
so don't worry, Jojo. I didn't think you were. I'm pointing out where we're going to get to. Again, this is the reason I'm presenting this whole podcast is it's very fascinating to look at like what Chase is having to do and why it's going to cause a problem later on. We'll get there.
Medical
Sorry, I know
use.
I keep hinting at
If
it.
you
We'll
are
get there.
prescribing puberty blockers for early onset puberty, you're treating something different than if you are providing it for gender dysphoria.
And you are in these cases, you are prescribing it to both male and female children, right? It didn't say you can only prescribe it to male children or you could only prescribe it to female children, right?
That's right. But I
Right.
think I would say that's not the reason we lost,
Okay.
although that was part of
Why did you lose?
But I think it's important to explain why that's not the reason, which is because the Equal Protection Clause does protect individuals. So there are examples where the court has said, peremptory strikes, when you're striking jurors, you can strike as many men or as many women, but if you're doing it based on sex, it's impermissible. So
Yeah, what Ross just tried to argue there is essentially like, okay, well, did you lose because like they were saying like what ultimately Chase is going to be arguing here is like, okay, you're discriminating against trans people because based on sex, because gender, you would prescribe these to a person who is not transgender, like a cisgender boy but not a cisgender girl. But what Ross is arguing, and actually legally it makes somewhat of sense in the sense that like this, I'm not saying this makes sense in actual rights, but in terms of legal defense, like, okay, well, this type of care, gender affirming care, you would give to both men and women, both seen as biologically male or female, and it's just the type of transgender care that is dangerous that we're just not going to prescribe at all. And that's not sex-based discrimination because you're just stopping this care, but it's not directly aligning with whether you're a boy or a girl biologically, but just the care itself is the thing that we are banning. Which would not be which is correct. It would not be sex-based discrimination. It would be gender-based discrimination because you're discriminating against transgender versus cisgender, but not based on sex, which is the argument that Ross just tried to argue there.
it's not a group.
Which is an argument that like could be argued legally. It's not what I would argue is like a transgender activist and like someone to like arguing what transgender people actually need. But because there's no gender identity-based protections under law, that's an argument that could get some
protection.
leeway.
It's an individual one. And
I agree.
Thought,
Jack the Bomb. To
right.
be very clear, you are correct. We lost because of bigotry in the court, not because the argument was flawed. Like Chase's argument's good, but I'm just pointing out like where Ross's perspective is and why he can make that argument.
Court obviously disagreed that the medical use imposed a sex classification, that John Doe, our client, couldn't get testosterone because his sex assigned at birth was female.
So Chase's argument's a bit more nuanced than that argument.
Was male. Even if there are different medical purposes in some instances, there are often the same medical purpose, which is to prompt male puberty. And you look skeptical.
I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole, but it is a treatment for a different condition.
But what makes the prohibition?
So this is where Ross is. This is again where I am getting. This is where things starting to go off the rails, right? Because you can see the argument that Ross is arguing, the one that I just made. But what Chase is having to do is get a little more nuanced with this, being like, because, and it's something that even is hard for me to argue because it's like it's legal mumbo jumbo arguments, but it's like because that you are assigning when you are giving the gender affirming care to somebody. God, it's even hard for me to describe. And Chase does a decent job of it there. But like because you are doing this to like someone assigned male at birth, let's just say. God, even I'm fucking confused. It's difficult as fuck. It imposes a sex classification based on that. And so if you would give this to someone who was not transgender, who was also assigned male at birth, but because of their, but because you're trying to like enable male puberty to happen, then you are sort of forcing a certain type of puberty to, you're favoring a certain type of puberty over another type of puberty, which is based on sex. I believe, right? Like I believe that's basically the argument. It's like you're trying to force a male puberty to happen for someone who's assigned male at birth, but you are favoring one type of puberty over another type of puberty. And that's why it's sex-based discrimination, because puberty is a sex-based phenomenon, not necessarily a gender identity-based phenomenon. It's a very confusing argument that even I'm like, I get it, but it's weird. And that's where Ross can enter into this conversation and be like, well, that's ridiculous, right?
And operative is whether the treatment is inconsistent with a person's sex or consistent with a person's
exactly.
sex. If two people named John go to the doctor's office and they say, I am a boy and I'm not developing my puberty in accordance with my peers, I need testosterone.
Right. If you go in and you say, I'm developing my puberty to reflect a sex that I do not believe myself to be, you don't get it. But those seem like different things.
Again, this is the distinction that Ross is. They're arguing two different kind of points.
If you change the sex, you change the condition, and that was dispositive. Our view was that if you hold constant the purpose, then you change the sex, and the outcome is different.
So yeah, we'll save the rabbit holes for a moment. Why, just whether as a legal matter or a political matter, why do you think this kind of argument persuaded two conservative justices in the first case and not in the second?
Well, I think
it's confusing as all hell, and we should have gender identity-based discrimination laws on the books.
In terms of the legal paradigms, the first case was a statutory case. This was a constitutional case. The interpretive frameworks for the Constitution are different. Usually, the court recognizes that something. Again,
this is all in the weedsy shit that I don't even know. So, like, this is again stuff where, like, I have a lot of respect for Chase having to argue these things. So this is all like beyond me.
Our analysis of the logic of why but for an individual.
And again, this is why, like, where Ross is going to come in here, because again, all of this is complicated as hell, that I don't even understand all these legal arguments that, like, Chase has to jump through to argue for transgender material rights right now under the law as it is. And because of that, Ross can come in and be like, you're being ridiculous. This doesn't make any sense. And this is exactly what I kind of wanted to get to. And this will get worse as we go, as you will see. But, like, this is the inroads that Ross gets to have here, where he's, like, forcing Chase to make this argument based under the law, because he's asking Chase to describe the legal frameworks here. But, like, there's a difference between what is under the law and what transgender, transgender rights would actually look like. And so Chase is kind of going to have to do this two battle-pronged thing of, like, being like, no, I understand your legal argument. Your legal argument is wrong, but mine's very confusing, and it's not even how I would argue transgender rights in the first place. You know what I mean?
Sex, and they agreed with us in the Title VII context.
Right.
I do think, as often happens, some of the atmospherics and some of the anxieties that animated this litigation, that animates these conversations, made their way into the framework.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of what I wanted to ask you about. Do you feel like just generally the political context of these decisions changed? In the first case, in Bostock, you're talking about issues related to transgender adults. And in the second case, you're talking about issues related to minors.
Again, now he's thinking, think of the children.
A shift in the politics of this issue.
So here's where he's going to start normalizing the right-wing rhetoric around we need to protect the children, right? Because now he's bringing in, which isn't even necessarily part of the case, but like, oh, well, you were talking about adults before, now we're talking about children, and that's a whole different ballgame, right? So this is him starting to normalize the think of the children rhetoric.
Issue over the last 4 or 5 years.
Oh, and yeah, people, I didn't even see in the comments, but Sarah's right. Please do not insult, we can insult Ross all day long for his bullshit political frameworks. Let's not insult someone's looks. I am very much against doing any of that.
Is connected to that shift and how Americans feel about adult decision-making versus children and teenage decision-making.
Yeah, I mean, I want to disentangle sort of the political from
is
legal.
This is Chase trying to be like, all right, so here's the legal stuff. Let's talk politically about like the bullshit that is being targeted against the transgender community.
Obviously, they are connected. As a doctrinal matter, the fact that it would be a minor versus an adult wouldn't change whether it was based on sex, and that was one of the things that we raised for the court. Which
does not matter in these
cases.
By this
logic, if Tennessee's law had banned this care for adults, that would also be okay.
Right.
But to Ross, the think of the children argument is important.
I also think something that was lost in this is, yes, these are minors, and we want to be able to have conversations about how to best protect and care for minors. But two important things that are true in this context. One is it was their parents who were making decisions, and we as parents have to weigh all sorts of questions when we're making medical decisions for our minor children, which we do, of course, in conversation with them and their doctors. And then
And this is going to be very important in a second, because what Chase is arguing here, and what Ross will intentionally obfuscate, is what Chase is arguing is not for transgender kids to immediately go into a hospital and like say, hey, I want, all of these, like, I want to like start on hormones, get surgeries right now. What they are asking for are for the ability to go into the doctor and have these options on the table and work with their doctors, work with the therapists, work with their parents, have these conversations in an open, honest way, and be able to be like, all right, where are you at? What do you need? What's the right path for you? Because I am very much someone of like, let people explore. Like, I've told this story before, my sister's open with me sharing this. My sister, when she was younger, she was exploring being trans as well. And my stepmom was very much like, what do we do? Like, what do we do here? And I'm just like, just let her explore. If she wants to wear dude clothes, like, don't go out and get her like testosterone right now. But let her explore and see what she wants. And maybe she'll come up with, like, I do want to be on puberty blocking drugs. I do want to, start taking testosterone at whatever time it's appropriate. But, like, let that be an exploratory thing. But how it's often presented and the sort of scaremongering that is done around trans affirmative care is, like, people go in and they instantaneously get all of these drugs. Now, these should be available to minors. Gender affirming care should 100% be available. It should be an option that they can have, not be banned. But it is not an instantaneous thing that people are just doing without any consideration. And in fact, I would argue if there are places that are doing that, of just like, hey, here you go, like, that's dangerous even just in a health matter, not even like mental health or this right treatment. Like, if you're just giving people without like checking on like their body needs, what's working, hormone, checkups like I have done, like there are ways that your doctor can go about like prescribing care that makes the best sense, your treatment plan for you. And we want to enable these conversations to be happening, enable people to get the care they need and the time they need, and not gatekeep it from them with not only just like making it illegal, but all the bullshit insurance shit that you need to, money, costs, like gatekeeping the, sort of disbelieving of transgender people, the questioning of transgender people, whether they're being believed or not when they're saying things. So like, this is ultimately what Chase is arguing. But as we're going to see repeatedly here, what Ross is going to keep coming back to is like this thing of like, well, we need to put a stop to it because, and the frame, like he's going to try and present himself as a neutral arbiter, but he'll be like, well, some people are saying sort of thing. But it is ultimately going to be arguing like we need to halt these things because it's dangerous to minors, right?
The second thing that I also think is important that that was lost here is that these bans, these categorical bans,
exactly what I was just saying that Chase is arguing
for conversations.
Exactly.
They do not leave room for more research.
Last question on this sort of legal environment, because you mentioned already that the decision to go to the court with this case, knowing you might well lose, was a difficult one. After the ruling was handed down, there was a lot of argument and discussion, including in an essay by one of my colleagues, Nicholas Confessori, about whether this had been a huge mistake for the transgender rights movement. You yourself were criticized by a number of people.
The argument is like, did trans people go too far? This is basically what he's saying. It's like, do we go too far with these? I'm just curious
if you can say a little more about whether, in hindsight, you think.
Hey, in hindsight, did you think your arguments were bullshit and like trans people were going too far and were being ridiculous and too maximalist in what they wanted, and shouldn't we be more normal? Essentially what he's saying here.
Knowing what you know now.
Can you say that for me on camera, trans person? Can you legitimize my views on the radical trans left? Is legitimately the condescending point that he's making here.
How would you have made the same decision?
And what he's asking Chase to do.
All the way to the court?
Well, so I guess the first thing I want to say is it certainly wasn't my decision alone, and this is, right. And I think it's really important. Also,
should be noted too, because Ross said you were criticized yourself. Should be noted, the criticism was from the New York Times. The criticism that Ross is referring to, I tried to find it earlier, but like there was, I think that was it maybe. I forget, but like Chase was criticized by the New York Times for this, on being like, you're going too far with it. So like, Ross doesn't say this, and I kind of want to just like look at Chase's face here.
Whether in hindsight,
I think Chase absolutely knows what's happening here. Like that face right there of like, oh man.
So I guess the thing I say is it certainly wasn't my decision alone, and this is, right. And I think it's really important because
and like this is the thing that Chase is going to be doing. It's like, look, it wasn't just me. Like I'm a lawyer. It's not like my job is to argue these cases for my client. Like, and you're coming after me because I'm the trans person with the face in this thing. But it's not just my decision. My job as a lawyer is to take these cases that my clients want. And I can turn down the case, sure, but like at the end of the day, like it's not just my decision.
There are clients, and there are many.
Oh, I didn't even know that, Karen. Oh no, I didn't even know that, Karen. I didn't realize Ross was the one who wrote that article. That's funny.
Moment,
and that actually makes me think, like, Chase, you should have known better.
The power to make such a decision as this,
right.
And at the same time, I will say that in November 2023, when we made the decision to collectively go to the Supreme Court with this, I think that there were more people who were with us at that time. It was, by the time it got to the court, I do think things had changed in the public. But when we were litigating these cases in the lower courts in 2022 and 2023, 7 district court judges, including 3 appointed by Donald Trump, had struck down these laws. And that
talking about the shifting political landscape
and then
here.
When that shifted and these bans started to go into effect, families that had never left Arkansas or Alabama or Tennessee uprooted their entire lives to care for their children, to try to find medical care. That felt like a dire set of conditions, and I think it was the right decision then, because the reality as well was there was already a circuit split. It was going to the court, and even more so, questions about sports and questions about bathrooms were also about to get to.
Yeah, basically he's saying, like, these things are going to the court. These were in the conversation. It felt important to try to make this case, especially right now.
The court. And so it was a hard calculus and a chessboard of harm and moving pieces. And I don't think in any of these contexts.
Yes. And it'll get worse, Mason.
Decisions.
Mason Kunz, it'll get even worse.
I wish that we had more tools now.
Yeah, Jojo, I'm just going to be very clear here. We are not insulting Ross's looks. Like, again, you want to insult Ross's politics all day long? I'm here for it. I'm doing the same thing. We are not going to insult how someone looks here. That's not acceptable line of going after somebody.
To fight back against the kind of attacks that we're seeing from the Trump administration that were very much blunted by the Scarametti decision. And also, I think it was important to fight back from the lower.
It's okay, Jojo. Just that's just the stand. Like, I appreciate you saying sorry. We're all good. No
the
hate.
Sixth Circuit decision that we appealed from had also cut off a lot of avenues of advocacy that the Supreme Court did not.
Like, give me an example.
So one example is that the Sixth Circuit had said that discrimination against trans people by the government does not warrant any special scrutiny.
So I want to try. Let's see if
a transgender person.
So I'm skipping ahead a little bit just because I want to get to some more interesting stuff, and I only have a little bit more time. I didn't realize this was going to take as long, but let's get through this.
Is someone with a gender identity, so their core understanding of their gender that differs from the sex that they were designated at birth.
Okay. What does it mean to have a male or female sex assigned at birth as distinct from being male or female in biological terms? What is that?
Again, biological terms, right? Again, it's reasserting this idea that biological sex, you know what I mean?
Distinction mean?
This is where, this is very insidious. I don't necessarily know what's going on in Ross's head, so I don't want to overextend, but like the way this appears to me is like setting Chase up to fail, right? Like setting Chase up to describe like sex as mutable, and then so he can go, aha, see, you're ridiculous. Like sex is X, Y, and XY, XX chromosome.
What that distinction means is at birth.
Yes, very more barking it.
By and large, a doctor looks at their genitals and says.
So here, this is where again you're gonna start to see Chase's gears turning, right? Because like Chase is gonna describe like sex is also mutable. There's many things that describe sex, but he's also going to try to skip past it a little bit because he knows that it's going to be something that people are going to get hung up on. And Ross is going to try and bring it back there and be like, you're ridiculous. So like, again, this is like Chase this is where, again, I think Chase was in the wrong to come on this podcast. I agree with, Chase is someone who I agree with. I think I agree with politically very much in a lot of senses. But Chase understands the audience that he's trying to argue to, because that's, again, his job as a lawyer, but it is, again, going to be something that Ross is going to try to, like, come back to and try to attack on, that, like, Chase is like, this is not a friendly field to have this conversation, because there's going to be a bad faith actor, or at least an actor who is, like, intentionally not going to try to understand this, that is going to try to, like, get at these things.
You know, you have a penis, we're going to put M. You have a vagina,
exactly,
Aaron.
Also,
F.
Good to see you, Aaron. I haven't acknowledged you. I meant to acknowledge you earlier, but adore you.
You know, the external genitalia are one facet of the biological components of sex. And there are others, chromosomes, hormones, secondary sex characteristics.
So, yes.
I would include within my understanding of sex how we see ourselves. So these are different aspects of our...
Chase understands sex is also a spectrum, not just gender.
Our biological sex. And then what differs from the sex we are given based on our genitals at birth, and whether we are a boy or a girl or a man or a woman, I think is most of the time we see ourselves exactly as the genital check confirmed. Most people do. And then that there's some of us who... hey,
Bellamy, it's good to see you. It's been a long time no see.
Something just fundamental and deep about the fact that that wasn't the right way of seeing us. And so I would say a man or a woman is someone who understands in their core that they are a man or a woman.
Which is, like, that right there is a pretty decent, like quick case description of, like, what trans is, and also acknowledging the spectrum of sex as well.
Is there a distinction, though, between, like, gender identity and biological sex? Or is this just a continuum?
I would say there's a distinction.
So, again, this is kind of a read that, like, Ross is trying to get to, is like, oh, you know, is there a difference, or is it all just a spectrum to you? And it's like, there's two spectrums, actually. There's a spectrum of gender identity, there's a spectrum of biological sex. Both are spectrums, both are interrelated, but they are both spectrums. But he's not clocking that.
So I do think, the way I understand it, that our gender identity does, it's in our bodies, it's in our minds, has a biological component. I think research suggests that there may be some, fetal hormonal exposures that make it a biological phenomenon, but I'm not saying it is biological sex as such. I do think that oftentimes the most salient biological components of our sex diverge from our gender identity. And those things are the...
So this is Chase being very, like, pointing to what we were pointing to earlier, right? Like, even cisgender people have some level of, like, disconnect between their biology and how they view their gender identity. It's why, again, women, like, will shave to sort of align with some form of, like, how they want to align, like, their gender identity, their gender performance, yada, yada, yada. It's informed by both social factors, physical factors, many different things, mental factors. But, like, that's essentially what he's kind of saying there. He's not outright saying it, because he knows that it'll be even more bullshit coming from Ross. But that's essentially what he's arguing there.
Disconnect that makes someone trans.
But when they do, you wouldn't say this person has a person who the doctor looks at them and says they have a vagina, they're a girl. You wouldn't say that person is biologically female but has a male gender identity. You would say,
again, confusing sex and gender identity right there.
Full out, and there may be some tension between that and certain elements of their biology, but it's not. There's no split.
I would say that I'm saying that,
I'm honestly, I'm not trying to, like, entrap you in something.
Sure,
I'm
Ross.
very interested
I don't feel entrapped.
In
I
this
don't
kind
feel
of category,
entrapped.
in understanding the kind of category.
I would say it. Maybe Ross isn't intentionally trying to do it, but Ross is definitely trying to, like, do a leading thing here.
In terms of, like, what, I mean, let me put it to this
Going
way,
back to legal
argument. So, a core claim of the transgender rights movement.
All right, here's where things are going to start getting worse and worse. This is where it started to get my blood to boil from here on
legal
out.
And constitutional protection. It serves legal protection in the same way that one's sex does and one's race does. deserves constitutional protection the same way that religion does.
Appreciate it.
But these are all different kinds of things, right? Like race and sex are seen as more about biology, ancestry, and so on than...
Right there, already going into like just waving at like race is biological without acknowledging that race is also a social construct. How we racialize people is also a social construct. So like right there, that was like, excuse me? Race is biological?
Then religion is. I want to understand where you think.
Yes, he's very much doing
transgender
light
identity,
eugenics
gender identity,
bullshit
however
here.
You want to phrase it, fits into that landscape.
Like that is straight up like dog whistle eugenics stuff. Like race is biological. Like transgender, like we're talking about social stuff, but there's real biological factors with race, just like there's real biological factors with gender. And it hints at, right, his understanding of the biological essentialism underneath all of this stuff. Right? Like, yes, you can, like, trans people may identify as something different than their biological sex, but their biological sex defines them, just as someone's race is defined by their biology, without understanding the entire social construct of race. Again, it's like, you can see these little snippets of the underlying biases in his presentation here.
Well, so I guess I think it's important to separate what we're talking about as a matter of law and what we're talking about as a matter of medicine.
See, this is the trap that Chase unfortunately has put himself into right here, right? Like, Chase is trying to be like, look, we've been talking about the law, and I can talk the law all day, but it's different from like what we're going to be doing, like describing transgender issues. But because we have set up this basis that Ross intentionally started the conversation around the legal protections around trans people and like fighting for those, is going to create this confusing now like thing that Chase has to disentangle, which is why, again, you do not go on to this podcast, a New York Times level podcast, and also your comment, heart to you. I will respond to that in just a second. I just want to finish this point, but heart to, I want to make sure I acknowledge it. But this is the problem, right? These types of like, I understand the desire to like talk about like on the New York Times of all things, like the law, the legal stuff of it. But like by starting there, you're already setting yourself up to fail, because you're already having to like acknowledge the ways in which we are having to contort understanding of trans people to fit a framework that was not built for us. These laws that we are trying to use to defend trans people that under sex-based discrimination were not built to include transgender people. So we have had to contort our legal arguments to be able to like demand defense of transgender rights. But they are not actually how we should be talking about or defending trans people. They are all with this implicit biological essentialism at their base. There is an implicit biological essentialism within the core kernels of all of these arguments that like Chase is having to navigate. And again, I have a lot of respect for his work doing so. He has done really great work doing that, but it is very different than on the ground, like ways that we need to argue for transgender rights. And it's the real big problem here. Also, your K comrade, heart to you. Thank you so much for your super chat. Mwah, you are amazing. I was just visiting your channel to properly cite your excellent work on Epic Times, only to catch you live. I'm Michelle. I mailed you the Star Trek. Oh, thank you. Oh, you are amazing. I still use those bookends. They're not in this room, but they're in the other room. Thank you so much. You rock as well. I adore you. But yeah, I use those. They're in my other room. I have a Star Trek. All my Star Trek books are in another room in my bedroom, because of course. And I use the bookends there.
I do think that legal prohibitions on sex discrimination include transgender people. Full stop.
Right.
And so that that what we have seen in the last 10 years is the emergence of a legal notion of biological
again, everything that I was just stating
that has come into the law that was new. And the displacement of sex as a legal category with biological sex as a legal category is a new phenomenon.
Mwah.
It comes
I appreciate you. Thank you, Veltwalker. I appreciate
you. About whether trans people should be able to use the bathroom that matches with our identity. So there's the question of how do we understand sex in the law, and where does transgender status, where do transgender people fit in with that? Then there's a medical scientific question.
Sorry, can I pause? Before 2016, do you
here's where we go.
Think about sex as a category that was distinct from biological differences between men and women. What do you mean by that change in 2016?
I think what we thought of
this is where Ross is going to try and get his inroads in.
And this is
so this is again this is why I wanted to do this thing, this part right here, because this is where we're going to start to see the turn.
Constitutional law,
right?
That it is just impermissible to discriminate against someone because of their actual, their perceived, their sex or their sex stereotypes. So it didn't necessitate defining sex. The Constitution, our civil rights statutes also don't define race. You can be discriminated against based on your actual or perceived race. You could be discriminated against because of your actual perceived sex. And so in that sense, if we're talking about the paradigm that prohibits discrimination, it didn't necessitate defining sex. And so we start to see this impulse to define sex for purposes of sorting and excluding trans people that comes in 2016. In that context,
and this is the very good point of like they're using sex, like sex-based rights, like the TERFs argue, to be like, all right, we're going to exclude trans people because they are not biologically male, biologically female. And because of that movement, then this is why we get stuck in like, now we're excluding trans people based on sex. So the law is being used to discriminate against trans people, not the other way around. And so again, Chase is having to contort the arguments that are usually used to exclude trans people to try to frame them as trans inclusive, which is again why it's a very difficult thing and a very hard job that he is left to do as a just a lawyer fighting for trans rights, right? So that is his ultimate point, is like, now we're seeing how the law is being used to exclude trans people based on the lack of like denoting that we can't discriminate against someone based on being trans.
I think that the definitions we see in the statutes that emerge then say biological sex, and I will say it changes. First in 20.
So that's what Chase is arguing correctly. Again, as a lawyer. Ross, is we're going to see in just 2 seconds, is going to argue, no, it was actually the trans people who confused things.
16, it says biological sex is what's on your birth certificate.
Again, normalizing the idea that trans people went too far starting in 2016.
Genitals. And then we start to see definitions that are more about chromosomes and reproductive anatomy. And that sort of changes over time over the last 10 years. So that's the law. And I think that's obviously where I'm most focused on
Thank you,
how
Jojo.
these terms
Appreciate you.
take on meaning.
So earlier we were talking about gender dysphoria as a medical.
And this is where he's going to start getting trans medicalists
for
here.
the experience of feeling like you are in the wrong body.
Like arguing, okay, being trans requires you to be dysphoric.
Then that transgenderism should be perceived primarily as a medical psychological condition.
Okay, so he's making the trans medical argument about being like, okay, so trans people should be seen as like a medical condition in need of treatment. So straight up, like, again, biological essentialism, trans medicalists, like, you're trying to get people to align based on sex
identity
rather than like gender identity
based on
and
the
things
definition
like that.
of having a gender identity that's different from sex at birth.
Right.
I think that there are, for many transgender people, particularly when you cannot live in accordance with that gender identity, a medical and psychological set of needs that emerge to bring your body, to bring your outward expression into alignment with who you know yourself.
Yep, exactly. The DSM did this a decade ago, but again, he's
tomorrow. The state of Tennessee presented medical and scientific evidence. This is just a hypothetical.
Just
right?
a hypothetical. Okay.
Medical.
This is okay. Here's where we go. This is where I got pissed.
Or scientific.
This is okay. Now we're starting.
That there was a treatment, an alternative treatment for the experience of gender dysphoria that reconciled the person's psychology to their natal sex, the sex on their birth certificate, their genitalia, whatever else. Well, I'm curious what you would say, but I'm very skeptical that you or any other transgender activist.
What he is arguing here, if you didn't catch it, is what if conversion therapy worked? Essentially, what he was arguing is like, this is my audience, you know this, but he's essentially arguing like the shit in Star Trek The Next Generation. Remember that episode, The Outcast, where there was that non-binary alien that identified as a woman and like fought for her rights, but she lost her legal case, and they forced her, like they did mental, like used whatever sci-fi mumbo-jumbo mental stuff on her to make her be like, oh no, I'm fine with being non-binary now, I just was wrong. It's basically saying, if we had a brainwashing technology that like made you made conversion therapy work. Like his hypothetical here, the hypothetical here is like, what if conversion therapy actually worked? You would probably be against that, you ridiculous trans person. So why, like, he's framing it as an argument of like, you can already see what he's trying to do here, right? Because what is going to happen here, and he's setting it up like, I'd be curious what your thoughts on that were. Because Chase is going to be like, well, like, that's ridiculous, right? He's like, well, why not? You would prefer that we, like, force all these medical changes onto trans people? Like, we change the sex? What if we just, like, they could just be fine in the body that they have now? If we could convert them to be fine in their body that they have now. Also, Hypo Amber, thank you, Heart, so much for your super chat. It's like, if we could just make conversion therapy work, that would be much better, right? We wouldn't be forcing all these unnecessary medical changes on people. That's essentially his hypothetical here. And obviously conversion therapy does not work. It is very harmful. It is, like, if there was this magical hypothetical world where you could push a button to make yourself like fit in a cisgender body, like whatever, yes, like that's a hypothetical, but it's not one that actually plays out in reality. And conversion therapy is a deeply harmful practice that hurts people, that hurts queer people, that hurts trans people, LGBTQ people, generally speaking. And he is arguing for that point. And Chase is going to have to make that point, and he's going to be able to use it to be like, oh, you're ridiculous. You would rather force these medical changes upon people. Again, we can already see here how Ross is setting up Chase to look ridiculous.
Group would say, okay, that's great. We're going to prescribe this treatment to teenagers expressing gender dysphoria. You would
yes,
say,
exactly. It's like JB Weatherwax. If it was a choice, sure. Like, again, like if this hypothetical that he's describing worked, sure. But this is a hypothetical that there is no actual way to do it. And in fact, it is a thing that is forced upon queer people that is mentally damaging, to force them to align to a view of themselves that is not their own, to fit more into whatever view people have of their, whether it's, Christians being like, you need to be fine in your God-given body, or you need to align with like a binary sex, as our culture tries to generally say, of like, oh, like non-binary is ridiculous, or like you'll just always be a man stuck in a woman's body, like all of that bullshit. So, David Dema, heart to you, have to head out. We'll catch the rest of it later. Thank you for this and keep it the good. Thank you so much for the super chat. Mwah. You are amazing. I adore you. Mwah. Thank you so much, my friend. All right. I mean, 255 AD, I would generally argue that too. I mean, we could already see how, like, conversion therapy, if this weird hypothetical worked. The Star Trek example is a good example of that, of like, it would be used to like force it upon people, to like brainwash them, and would be used as a terms of control. Like, there's no real hypothetical situation where any technology like that wouldn't be used for some level of control and taking away autonomy and punishment of people. I would argue it'd be wrong no matter what, for 100% sure. But in this magical Candyland scenario that, Ross is describing here, is being used to frame Chase as ridiculous.
Treatment works by suppressing who they actually are.
So the treatment is aimed at the distress. And I would say, for me, that if there was a treatment tomorrow that said you could take this medication and you could change.
Again, this is Chase trying very hard to like,
I guess it
to
depends
like
on the premise.
Yeah, see, this is Chase being like, starting to argue that hypothetical and being like, no, this is utter and complete BS. Like, like trying to make it work and realizing the trap that they're in here.
Then it would be a question of, do I
He's in there here. I said that.
Being a transgender person and having this discordance, or do I want to go and have a different experience? I think the premise suggests that you could change that gender identity and then you'd make a decision about how it is.
Yeah, literally describing the blue pill.
Without distress. I wouldn't say no
one should
have access to
that. He's like, no, I wouldn't say no one should have access to that if it's a choice, but again, it's like, it's a bullshit scenario.
About how to live most safely and comfortably in your body.
Like,
right now,
like Chase is arguing is like, whatever, as long as they have autonomy, sure.
We know is that forcing people to live in a way that doesn't align with their gender identity does cause significant distress. And one set of medical interventions that has shown to significantly reduce those symptoms of distress, anxiety, depression, and suicidality are
again, correct.
These hormone interventions that
but again, arguing on the medicalist terms.
When getting back to the question of,
like, the thing though here though is Chase is still arguing based on Ross's premise of like, transgender
sort of
requires medical intervention.
Nature of transgender,
which now Chase is trying to swing it back into not being medicalized.
I guess I feel like we can't.
Like, again, Chase just tried there to swing it back to, like, okay, yes, there's the gender dysphoria treatment stuff, the medicalist argument here. But then being like, all right, well, we can talk about a larger conversation what transgender is. But then Ross does not accept that.
Like, one reason that this issue is so fraught is that it's very hard to escape that question, right? Because
it's very easy to if you're not
stuck
in this mindset, Ross.
We're both moving back and forth.
See, this is, again, this is exactly the trap that I told you Ross was laying here. Making, like, Chase is trying to expand out into these larger conversations to explain trans rights on a larger avenue. But Ross is still bringing it back to the biological essentials arguments that, like, Chase had to start out with by describing the legal cases. So, like, Chase is not actually being allowed to, like, make an actual argument about trans rights here because Ross keeps dragging it back in.
Language that seems appropriate to something that...
Sorry, I love it. A serious journalist asking, but what if magic? Correct.
Psychological disturbance in search of a cure.
What if weird Star Trek space science bullshit mumbo jumbo actually worked?
That would be appropriate to the description of a persecuted religious minority or women or men discriminated against unjustly, right? And I think you want to reconcile that tension by saying that there are these symptoms of distress.
Oh God, I can just see Chase's face
for those symptoms that works by effectively confirming biologically the psychological experience.
Again, going back to biological essentialism is like, oh, you want to try and, like, you know, get people to like change their bodies to align with sex when we could just do something else. We could do magic, right? And, like, this is some tension. Like, you're trying to say, like, we're just you're trying to say, like, trans people are like a religious minority or whatever, which is ridiculous because you're, like, arguing on these medicalist terms.
Well, I wouldn't say it's confirming, because that suggests it has a role in reinforcing what the experience of one's gender is. I think it is more aligning one's outward appearance with their understanding of themselves.
But it's more than appearance, surely, right? It is your hormonal experience, your biochemical experience, I think we can both agree, is very hard to separate from your psychological experience.
Which is correct. Right? So, like, yes, you're, like, stuff that, like, even just, like, me, like, my shifting my body, like, getting breast augmentation, even without hormones aspect, like, hormone changed, like, how I interact with the world, too. But even just plainly changing sex characteristics, just instantaneous, like, breast augmentation, vaginoplasty, like, it changed how I interacted psychologically and physically and, like, in the world. Like, these things are interconnected. But what he's ultimately arguing is, like, oh, that's dangerous, right, to do that.
I mean, I don't want to, like, you know, be too personal here, but can you talk about your own experience a little bit? Or
Maybe that'll help make it.
And now we get into the whole, like, well, can you put your own personal self on display for us now, trans person. Like, tell me your trauma story about being trans so that I can, like, understand what being trans actually is. You know what I mean?
Make it more concrete.
Yeah.
And what Chase tries to do here is very fascinating.
You know, I do think it's important to talk about, you know, sort of how we're conceptualizing it in law and how we're conceptualizing it in medicine. But, you know, my experience is that I had no idea what it meant to be transgender growing up. My first encounter with a transgender person was Boys Don't Cry, the film about Brandon Teena, who is murdered. With Hilary Swank playing Brandon Teena. And that, however,
How old were you?
Oh, gosh. I was born in 1982, so this is around 17.
Yep.
And my experience growing up is one of self-alienation from my body. But I did not have words for it. I didn't have language for it. And in my recollection of my childhood, I do not recall ever thinking, oh, I am not a girl.
Right.
I just knew I was unhappy. I was in therapy. I, did all of the things that you're supposed to do and had parents who loved me and tried to support me. And I then continued to have this sense of distress And
again, what Chase is doing here is what so many of us trans people do, which is put our life into a narrative that makes sense for a cis audience, right? Like, he is saying, like, I felt this distress. Like, these are the keywords that, like, it reminds me of, like, when I was trying to get my gender confirmation surgeries, when I was trying to get breast augmentation, I had to go and see a therapist, and I had to tell this sob story about, like, I had all this distress. I, like, felt this way since I was a little kid. Like, it's these, like, not that it's completely untrue, but it's, like, these very, like, specific keywords that you have to do to, like, fit the little box that they want to understand trans people within, so you can get approval for your medical interventions, right? Like, if I had actually told the truth and be like, well, it's more complicated, like, I, sometimes feel like a woman, but sometimes don't, they'd be like, well, if you sometimes don't feel like a woman, why would we approve your breast augmentation? Why would we pay for that? Because you clearly don't need it all the time. So, like, you know what I mean? So it is like trying to contort a trans experience into this very A, medicalized, and B, like, easy, neat narrative for people to understand.
To look for more help as a young adult. So go to therapy, talk to people, and what ends up happening is I get diagnosed with gender
Yes, exactly.
dysphoria.
Meeting the criteria for gatekeeping by or cis understanding 0.
You're in your 20s.
I'm in my early 20s.
Oh, you said that wrong.
And and I'm graduated from.
Also noting how Ross is noting the age, because 17, 20, he's like, well, you're old enough. You weren't a minor.
I work at a law firm. I am trying to pursue my life, but I'm being held back by the sense that I can't look in the mirror. I don't want to shower. I don't want to go outside. So, and throughout this time, I should say, there's no real access to the internet. There's no social media, and I am.
So you are as a teenager, like,
yeah,
okay,
just a gender nonconforming teenager and young adult who then comes out as gay and still just feels this sense that it's not I'm uncomfortable with my body as such, but my body is the wrong body for me, but I don't have the language for it. I think that ultimately
Chase was trying to avoid saying there, by the way, very clearly, like, born in the wrong body, because that's a term that's very outdated in the trans community. It's because it's, again, sort of like being like, oh, we can change, like, oh, we need to be put into another body to fit, like these pre-selected buckets of what bodies are, as opposed to, like, our body can be malleable and we can shift it to be what we want it to be to make ourselves more comfortable, at least to whatever level of medical interventions can let us do that. So, like, he's having to tell this, like, very specific story, but also trying to avoid these, like, pieces that, like, could easily be taken, again, into these biological essentialist ways.
What ends up happening is I have...
I was just very interesting because you could just see that moment that Chase was, like, trying to, like, navigate around that.
Realization through lots of therapy that there is something called transgender, that fits my experience, and that I start to then think about how to align my body with my sense of myself as male.
I actually want to say this too. Lauren Alexander, you were saying, like, kids knew I was a girl before I did. I just never acted like a guy. This is why, follow me on this sidetrack here for a second. But this is why it's so important we need to see more representation of trans women being played by trans women and trans men being played by trans men, non-binary people played by non-binary people in media. Because continually, over and over and over again, I think most notably, like, you have cisgender men playing trans women in movies, TV shows, and it keeps reaffirming that, like, oh, you're actually, you're a trans woman, but we can still see that you're a man. Like, we can always tell. Like, it justifies that narrative of, like, we can always tell. But there's this really, and it struck me, because I just realized how much I don't see it enough. But there's a show called Veneno, which all of you should go out and watch. Veneno is fucking amazing. It's on HBO Max. It's 10 episodes. One of the most beautiful, I don't want to spoil too much of it, is one of the most beautiful trans-inclusive shows it's not even trans-inclusive. It is so fucking, like, there's every character on that is trans. There's, like, every type of trans person that you will ever meet is in that show. And I love it so much. But what was so powerful to me, and I didn't even realize it, was the first episode of the show, we follow one of the main characters. We follow two different characters throughout their entire life. And we start off the show with one of those characters as a teenager, before they've come out, like, before they've even admitted to themselves that they're trans. And it's played by a trans woman. And what makes that so remarkable is there are characters around her being like she's like, I'm not trans. And every character around her is like, sure, baby. Sure, you're not trans. And it just had me hit this moment of like, oh, like, this is what we need more of like, not this message of like, we can always see that you're a man underneath, but this thing of like, oh, you're pretending to be a thing that you're not, and you are actually a woman, and everyone can see it but you, that because you're not willing to admit it to yourself that like you want to grow into be a woman. And having a trans woman play that, having a trans woman character, trans women play that and like have this moment of everyone being like, we know you're a girl just by the way you move in the world, not just physically, but like her mannerisms and how she holds herself. Is just like, we know you're a girl, even though you're saying you're a boy. And it created this powerful sense of like, oh, we can see you're a woman. And it's validating not only like the character, but also this idea of like the trans woman playing her is a woman, and we see she's a woman. And like that being able to see that she's a woman underneath this like male veneer that she has put on is so wonderful. It was such a beautiful thing to see in that show. And again, it's not just like physically like that she looks like a woman, but like just like the way the actor held herself even as like presenting as a boy before coming out, of like just like crossing her legs and like being like you just these things of like this gender performance that's like there. It was just such a beautiful show and such a really great thing to see. And we need more of that. Not just trans women playing trans women, but I even want more trans women to play pre-coming out trans women. I think specifically. And I know that can be dysphoric for some trans women, so I'm not saying every actor should be called upon to do that. But for those who are comfortable, I think we need way more of that. It was really powerful.
And my experience is not representative of a lot of people, I'll say, because I do, as maybe, is noticeable, I don't express myself in a very...
Oh, like, Anthony, good to see you, by the way. Just to say, that's the first episode of Veneno. And that's just like a subtle thing. Like, Veneno is so good. Like, can I like, slightly, like, R-rated. We're going to get a little R-rated here. In episode 2 of that show, it is an episode talking about sex as a trans person. And like, we have one storyline of one character who's like, I don't want any surgeries, bottom surgery or whatever. I want to just have sex and like da-da-da-da. And then you have another trans character being like, I don't know, I want to have bottom surgery, but like, I'm nervous about what an orgasm will be like afterwards. And it's like these conversations that like you don't see on TV, because that's a real thing for a lot of trans women, especially. I don't necessarily know for trans men, it's probably a different conversation. But for trans women, like, there's a real fear of like, what's sex gonna be like after this? Am I gonna be able to orgasm? Am I still feel pleasure? And like the show like does it and like talks about orgasms in a very beautiful way, in a very cinematic way. Like, it's just such nuance. And that's episode 2, everybody. Like, that show just goes to places, and it's so good. Veneno. If you have not seen Veneno, go out and watch it. It is one of the best shows that I have seen. So,
masculine fashion. I try.
And it's on HBO Max.
I recognize that I'm going to have a androgynous appearance. Mm-hmm. That is part of how I see myself.
Oh, yes. Sarah, as you mentioned, on Saturday, I'm going to be doing the Christmas Carol over on Sarah's channel. So if you want to see a good Christmas play, raising money, Sarah can tell you, I think, what the charity I think we're going to be raising for. I believe we're raising for a charity, right? But it's we're performing the Christmas Carol. So it should be very, very fun.
But then I did spend time in my early 20s, having access to surgery.
Spelled Veneno,
taking hormones. And
yep, that's how you spell it.
Feel
like
everything.
Veneno. I think the N has like a tilde over it. But,
that I had tried
the N,
to get rid
has
of
tilde over.
What made sense. And I was able, I was able to go to law school. I was able to become a lawyer that went into court, things that seemed absolutely unimaginable to me before. And recently, when my mother was selling the house that I grew up in, and I went back, was packing things up, I found some old journals. And every single one of those journals had these just painful memories.
Palestinian Children's Relief Fund. Thank you, Sarah.
Why I'm not a girl.
So we'll be raising money for the Palestinian Children's Relief Fund.
And I can't explain it in words, these visceral core feelings, just like many things that
turn up the video bit.
People don't understand until they feel them, inherent to who we are. I talk to members of my family who have ADHD who are trying to explain to me what it's like to be in their brain. I cannot imagine it. And the best I can do is recognize that I don't understand it, and also try to support them in how they navigate.
So
in
Chase
the
is
world.
trying to make
And
that
so,
argument of like, look, like I don't understand cis people, but I tried to support them, but like, so you should be doing the same for me.
That's a little bit how I think about it.
Yep.
Or any other aspect of our lives that we can't articulate
not
so
for a
well,
second,
but feels so
Jack the Bomb.
core
Not for
to
a
who we
second.
are. And when we look back, there's all this evidence of where it was in things that we didn't have language for.
Can you just say something about just on the point about medical interventions, like
Back to medical
felt
interventions.
the connection between that sense of sort of psychological change?
Again,
and
he's going back to
acceptance
transmedicalism of like you need to
making-
have some level of distress that you need to
hormonal
be
and
cured by
biological changes to your body.
with
Yeah,
gender
and
affirming surgery.
again, I'm saying this from my experience.
Yeah.
Everyone's is different, and the best I can say is it felt like coming home. It felt
skip ahead a little bit.
clients
'cause we're just
about
gonna-
their kids, and I
just so we're not going to
understand
go
why
through every bit of Chase's
people
story.
feel
Chase
nervous when it
performs
comes to
it
kids.
For Ross.
I have a kid. I get very anxious about bringing my kid to the doctor and not understanding what information I'm getting.
We've been again
back.
lost the plot on laws
And
here.
I
Like
also
we're losing
think-
like Ross has again sort of shifted the conversation, but in a way that like has not allowed Chase to like make very clear what the position is and
That
the
we
distinction
as
between
parent-
law and like actually being trans. And it's like Ross continually trying to like present Chase in this very weird framework.
do a lot of work to help our children grow and thrive. And I think my clients who made these decisions for their children also did that.
So let's talk about that difference for a minute, because I think
Oh, hey, Anthony. Sorry. Yeah. Just saying we're, just, we're not doing any insulting of people's looks, in this. Like, I don't like Ross. Ross sucks. He's not good, but, we just set a rule in the chat to like not insult anyone's looks, even if we think they're pieces of
that
shit.
the story that you just told, or what you just described, is something, the acceptance of narratives like that, I think, has been, in certain ways, at least partially accepted in American life. The language has changed, right? People would say sex change operation, not gender affirming care, and so on. But the idea of some form of male to female or female to male transition in adulthood as a form of psychological reconciliation.
Again, medicalism. Like we've accepted this for a very, very, very long time. And like to a degree that is true. There was like very long this sensationalism journalism around sex, quote unquote, sex changes. And it was very sensationalist, but it was very much like, oh yeah, this is accepting. However, if you actually go back and look at some history, like in America, there was this sensationalism, like acceptance to it to a degree, but it was always when it's done medically. Of like, oh, they went to like a doctor and got a sex change and now they look like a bimbo bombshell. Like it was very like sexualizing of these trans women as well, throughout history. Of like, look, now they look like a very pretty woman, or whatever. But if you actually look at some history, there's a really good book, I talked about it over on my secondary channel, called The Other Olympians, about how in sports, back in the, I believe, 30s, there were two essentially trans men, two people who've seen women performing women's sports, came out as trans men, and this was sort of like seen as a big scandal. It's like, look, there's people trying to get into sports to try to win women's sports. But then the concern shifted. People like forgot that it was about trans men who came out, and like the trans men were like, we would like to perform in men's sports. We have no desire to perform in women's sports at all. And then people were like, well, there's people pretending to be women to get into women's sports to try to win it. Like there's men pretending to be like, but it was trans men, but they're making that argument about trans women. And then this was used to try to clamp down on sex-based discrimination within the Olympics around the Berlin Olympics. And there were actually Nazi doctors, quote unquote, being like, we need to worry about like men pretending to be women to try and get into sports. and we're trying to clamp down on definitions of being a woman to try to reassert like this very standard version of womanhood. It's a very similar thing to we're seeing now. But then they even made the argument at that same time of like, we don't need to police men's sports because, you know, if any women got into men's sports, they would obviously lose. So it's no big concern of that. We just need to really police women and women, like how women look. And this came out in the Berlin Olympics, that there was a woman, I believe, runner. I forget her name off the top of my head. It's in the book, so I'm blanking on some of the specifics here, so forgive me. But there was a woman who was a cisgender woman her entire life who was, people started questioning whether or not she was actually a woman, if she was actually like a man pretending to be a woman because she had more masculine presenting features. Again, very similar things to what we see today. The same thing with like J.K. Rowling towards the boxer in the Olympics just a few years ago. It's again these cycles of like liberalism and fascism that are focused on the biology and this biological essentialism and in policing what women have to be. And obviously that gets into racial coding as well. Black women and many women of color are often not going to be considered to be true women, even if they are cisgender, because they don't conform to these sort of standards of white womanhood that we sort of have framed in our mind. So,
back decades.
So like Ross is correct here, but it actually is not in the way that he wants. He was like, oh, we were so accepting back then. It's like, yes, we were accepting in these very spectacleized terms that reinforced these ideas of like transmedicalism and that transness was binary and that like when trans people came out, they had to want to be like a total, like the most masculine dude or the most feminine bimbo bombshell for like sexual sexualization.
In American life, in some ways, right? And certainly by the time you get to the late 2010s, 2020, and so on.
And then here's where he's going to go. The trans activists just took it too far.
I think there's just sort of widespread acceptance in American life that this is a free country.
It's like, hey, we were fine with the trans
people
people
kind of
for a
personal
while.
Experiences. They make these kind of choices. You might be skeptical of those choices, but they are things that sort of we make space for.
In 2020, it was just a perfect utopia for all people. But right in 2020 is when we just hit that point and it's like, yeah, this was it. It was real good. Everything was great for everybody in 2020.
From my perspective, what changes in a big way, again, starting in the late 2010s and then continuing into the present, right, is that the argument from activists becomes that
and here we go.
Kind of treatments and experiences should be available, not just to 20-somethings and 30-somethings and 50-somethings and everyone else.
No,
right?
the trans activists went too far and just wanted to infect
minors.
the youth.
And over that same period, you get an absolute explosion.
None. No, Anthony, no hate crimes before.
Transgender, non-binary, gender non-conforming self-identification among kids. And then offering treatments that are...
So this is the right... He is literally positioning, and he's making it very clear this is his position. This is the right-wing, like, scare tactic, right? Like, we were all accepting of adults, but then you went and wanted to get these treatment for kids. He's going to, I believe in just a minute, make the sort of, like, social contagion argument, the rapid onset gender dysphoria argument, this idea that, like, oh, because trans people came more out and were more popular, like, kids just thought it was, like, a cool social trend, and then we sent them to hospitals, and they just got pumped full of hormones, and then now there's this detransition era of, like, this is the right-wing thing that he is presenting here to Chase to try to knock down as like his legitimate side of the argument, his like, this is how I see it, and like forcing Chase to like argue back this point and not like listening to Chase as an expert on his field on being trans. And like, as a trans person, number one, I'm literally being a lawyer who has argued these things, who has understanding of the history, works for the ACLU. No, he is saying, well, here's my like passing understanding of like transgender issues that I've gotten from the fear-mongering tactics from the right wing. And just presenting that as just like, this is actually how it is, and forcing Chase to now argue this point. Because Chase is going to have to argue like, no, you're wrong on that point. And then this becomes the argument, right?
Are, let's say, debatable in their reversibility. And that have...
Right there, too. His quote, debatable in their reversibility. Positioning puberty blockers as debatable in reversibility. We have the science on this. Puberty blockers are, by and large, reversible. Are there edge cases on things? There's always true with every single drug that, like, some things can be dangerous, some things can be not for every single person on every single medication. This is true. But, like, they are reversible. They put a pause on puberty, allow kids to have more time to decide puberty. what they want to go through.
Pretty profound effects.
But he's already positioning, like, again, he's just slipping these things in here. Let's just say debatable on their reversibility. Debatable. When they're not really, but it is only debatable when it comes to trans context.
On, sort of your literal body, fertility, all of these things, that just introduces incredible levels of danger of making the wrong decision.
I mean, I know that is
you can see why
of many people.
Yeah, see, again, Chase is like, I understand this is the view, but like, again, and this is why I don't envy Chase in this position, but Chase put himself in this position. It was a bad move, in just my opinion. Because, like, again, you have put yourself in position to argue on a bad framework. And now you've set yourself up, because you were talking legalese, to, like, now you have to, like, kind of deconstruct some of your own legal arguments to try to argue back against what Ross is presenting to you. Because Ross is now presenting the, like, actual trans, like, what we want to actually fight for trans rights based on, like, a gender-affirming care, access to these things, getting access to, like, accepting our identity as real and believing us as we explore these identities, right? But now, like, Chase is in a position of having to deconstruct his own argument while also pushing back against Ross's bad faith framework.
And let me offer a little bit of a different perspective on sort of how this emerges.
Chase is like, he's like soft saying, you're wrong. Let me tell you how it actually is.
And sort of some
and having to push back against this nonsense.
Things that you're pointing to, because I would
again, it's just like, it's a situation where it's like, I understand why Chase wanted to do this, but like at the end of the day, you're just normalizing this, and it's allowing Ross to make you look ridiculous because of the way that the conversation has been allowed to flow.
Say that the beginnings of using these medications to treat adolescents comes from activists. I think what we see is that endocrinologists who are treating adults starting to see...
You can see why my blood pressure went up during watching this. I'm like, I see every rake that Chase was walking into, and it was very frustrating. And again, I have a lot of respect for what Chase does, but this interview was, I think, was badly considered.
See young people coming into their clinics and trying to figure out whether or not, as often happens with medicine, and you have a treatment that works for adults and you wonder if you can start to use it in an adolescent population, and it emerges through the medical community trying to provide treatment for young people that are coming into their offices suffering. And this happens in Europe first, and then in the United States in the late 90s and early 2000s. Mm-hmm. So it's not that you have this all of a sudden happen in 2010.
Yes.
And
correct.
Many of those clinics start to see very significant improvements in the populations that they're working with, and they continue to want to study them. And
like, trans issues is not a new science. It's been set back many times because of stuff like the Institute of Sexology being closed, the defunding of different things, of like the Institute of Sexology being burned, by the Nazis. So we've had many setbacks, but like this trans like medicine didn't just appear in the 2010s and like all of a sudden we were pushing it on kids. Like, these things existed. I remember like when I was coming out as trans, and this was in the 90s, early 2000s, right? Like, I was even aware of like puberty blockers, and it's something I regret to this day a little bit, where it's like, I wish I had had the courage to come out as trans around that time. Because then I could have gotten on puberty blockers and not gone through puberty, which was very difficult for me. But this was understood at the time. This wasn't something that just randomly knew happening.
To see the rise of gender clinics in the United States that are treating young people.
In a, should be said, a fairly deregulated medical atmosphere.
Sorry, Vera. Yeah, I wanted to get to this video.
Right.
Yeah.
The U.S. generally.
Yes, I think there's a lot of differences between the U.S. and Europe, absolutely. And one of the ways that medical care in the U.S. is much worse than in many parts of Europe is that we don't have good access to mental health care. And I submit that's a very serious problem across the board, especially in rural communities and poor communities. And these gender clinics are trying to account for that. They're trying to, rather than have people go into either more underground spaces, more dangerous spaces, combine these multidisciplinary teams.
Arguing for getting actual access to this care. And like, these pieces are trying to address this. They're not trying to shove people like just automatically getting like some prescribed, like, you're definitely becoming like this now. It's like actually presenting ways to get access to a large array of different things that can help trans people, and what gender affirming care is for each individual person.
that are aimed at treating young people in a way that is supporting their mental health, that is understanding any co-occurring conditions, and ensuring that their parents understand all of the risks and benefits of any potential intervention. And that is my experience in learning about these clinics, which I did not really interface with until CARE was started to be shut down in 2021. But studying them, I see them as very highly sophisticated, well-funded research clinics at institutions.
I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit. Just here.
The clinics themselves providing the care. I think that there is a broader
here. This is where he's going to basically argue rapid onset gender dysphoria.
It would take a different argument or conversation to unpack. Right?
It would take a different conversation argument to unpack, but I'm going to at least put it out there so that people will hear it and not allow you to push back on it.
There is sort of a certain kind of social cascade that falls.
Uh-oh, my screen froze. No. Uh-oh. Oh, no. Everything's frozen. Give me a second, everyone. Let's see if I can fix this. Sometimes my computer's been acting up and been freezing. It'll be back in just a second, but let us see. Come on. Come on. You gonna work with me here? No. Uh-oh. There we go. There we go.
Honestly follows from debates about same-sex marriage and
sorry about that. Are we back? There we go.
And so on, where gender identity, questioning your gender identity, sort of thinking
so this is rapid onset gender
dysphoria as a
argument
distinctive thing in the context of adolescence and puberty and so on, just becomes a broad cultural phenomenon. And then it's the combination of that,
I'm sorry.
That culture.
I just need to. This is. I feel so bad for Chase. But like, look at Chase's face here.
I have known parents, liberal parents, progressive parents, in the context of the last 5 or 6 years, who have a child who is gender nonconforming or self-identifies as trans over some period of time, who are also trying to do the best thing for their.
So again, what he's doing here is making the argument for transphobic parents, number one. And also centering parents, and not the kids. So first, what he's doing here is he's centering parents, like we need to worry about the parents' feelings, not what the kid needs. And also the type of parents he's talking about, he's not saying it, but they're parents who are scared of like their kid identifying as trans and are scared of not wanting to help them. But scared like that their kid will be trans and that they'll like be some sort of weird freak or whatever, right? And like Chase will push back against this, but like that's the underpinning of what Ross is saying.
But are living in a state of deep fear and anxiety that if they say the wrong thing, this child will be persuaded by the cultural atmosphere to do something.
It's trans people are just a fad that kids are getting in on. Then they're going to get irreversible damages.
That of medical interventions that are potentially irreversible.
So basically the turf talking point, the very fascist turf talking point.
And have lifelong consequences. And I'm curious what
it's literally the irreversible Abigail Schreier narrative.
Think about those kind of fears.
Well, I think a few important points. One is that a very small percentage of people who are transgender ever go to a gender clinic than the number of people who then have access to treatment.
This is Chase making the point, like, it's not all medicalization all the time. And also what we're trying to do, and you'll see Chase say this tonight, is like, we're not trying to argue that everyone should just start getting on hormones. We're arguing that people should be allowed to explore what they need in a safe, affirming environment that allows them to explore in whatever way is best for them. And that may mean puberty blockers. It may mean eventually hormones and some level of surgery or whatever that works for them. But at the end of the day, maybe it just means access to a therapist. Maybe it means just wearing different clothes and having people who affirm them and having a doctor say, or a therapist say, like, yes, parents, that's a correct avenue to go down. Like, these are things that people should have access to. It's not just go in, start transition today. It's being able to have those conversations.
Treatment is even much smaller. So we have a significant amount of gatekeeping here at many levels. Some people don't recognize that they have a dysphoria. They may identify as transgender, never go to the clinic. Then within that is, you get smaller and smaller into the actual number of people who then are diagnosed with gender dysphoria and assessment, and then assessed to have a need for medical intervention. And then I also want to be clear that many of these young people are not experiencing dysphoria for the first time at puberty. There are many young people who have a consistent and
maybe this is not
persistent
the one I thought it was.
presentation and insistence of themselves as girls who are assigned male at birth from very young ages, including in families where the parents have no idea what it means to be transgender. And they are learning about it over time after many years of confusion about what is going on with their child. I think that I will say, as a
my
parent,
child's a person?
I understand having all sorts of fears about what my kid is going to see on social media, what is going to happen at school. And I think we're primed to have a lot of anxiety about our children. And I personally feel that a lot of the anxiety I have about my child is very reasonable. I also don't think that there is an incentive for people to become trans in the world. This idea that if the parent says the wrong thing, the child will then go become transgender is not something I've seen born.
Yeah, that's the fear that, like, there's like, oh, if I say the wrong thing, they're suddenly gonna, like, run away from me. Like, this is the fear that right-wing people have instilled. You saw it in, like, the Matt Walsh I Am a Woman film from years ago, where he was just like, you know, yeah, if you say the wrong thing, the, like, Epic Times actually did a video on it too, where it's just like, what I did my video on, like, if you say the wrong thing, your kids are gonna call you transphobic and then run away and get pumped full of hormones and the state will take them away from you, and then they'll want to detransition and, you know, die by suicide or whatever. You know what I mean? And it's like, that doesn't actually bear out at any point. It's a right-wing instilled fear about transness.
I wouldn't say that it's, I think that's a slight oversimplification of what I mean. It's more parents who have children who are already identifying as transgender. The parent has strong doubts about the permanence and durability.
So the parent does not believe their kid, is what you're saying. The kid comes out as trans and the parent doesn't believe them and doesn't want them to, you know, he would say worry about, like, getting, you know, pumped full of hormones. But again, that is not what happens at these gender clinics.
Of that identification, but is afraid that if they resist it too strongly, they will get a reaction
again,
from
this
the
is a
child
right-wing, the right-wing fear-mongering point, right? That, like, oh, if you say the wrong thing, my kid's going to run away from me, and then the state will take them away and fill them through of medical interventions, you know? And it's, again, transphobic parents not wanting to actually listen to their kid and work with doctors on figuring out what's going to make the most sense. So
pushes them further towards
don't have kids
the
if you want
funnel of
clones.
medical and surgical interventions. That's what I mean.
This is the thing too, like, this is the thing that the right-wing fears. Like, you always listen to right-wing fears, and they're always like, well, if I say the wrong pronoun, trans people are going to jump down my throat and call me transphobic. It's like, no trans person, like, if you screw up a hormone, if you screw up a pronoun, no trans person is going to get angry at you. We always care about intent. Like, that's the thing. Let me tell you a story. I'll actually tell you this story, right? Because this is a very sweet story, and it'll illuminate my point. And all of you know this, but I think it's a one that I really love. I was working on, there's the show Subliminal, which is the Nebula series that I directed an episode of that's going to come out sometime next year. And I was directing that episode, and there's this, our lead actor in the episode is John Rubinstein. He's amazing, one of the sweetest men you've ever known. Like, even when we were talking, he was just, like, talking to me about politics, about, like, yeah, fuck. Like, he was basically like, I was just at the ICE protest, and, like, I want to know about, like, we got into, like, gender anti-assimilatory stuff. Like, he was very much like, oh, wow, like, tell me more about, like, why, like, fighting against, like, legal stuff. Like, he was very, very interesting. I love this guy. He's, like, an 80-year-old man. He's been in Star Trek. He was in Star Trek Enterprise playing a Vulcan. I believe he's an episode of Star Trek Voyager as well. But anyways, really wonderful actor. I adore John Rubinstein to death. One of the sweetest men, right? And clearly very affirming of me, caring about me, like, was interested in me. Like, he was just a great guy to work with. However, on set, I would direct him numerous times, and he would just say, yes, sir. And then he would say, yes, sir. And then he would immediately go, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. And he would do it over and over and over again. And I had to, and he's just like, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean it that way. I'm like, and I had to, like, sit him down. I, like, took him aside and sat John down, and I was like, John, I love you and adore you, and you do not need to I appreciate the apology. It is very, very sweet, but I want to let you know you do not need to apologize, because I know it's an ingrained thing. I appreciate you working on it, but, like, at the end of the day, I know you're not trying to misgender me. Your intent here is not to be mean to me. I get it. I appreciate the apology. I know you're working on it. You don't need to, like, I know, because especially also as, like, an actor, it's like throwing him out of the scene because he's like, oh shit, I'm sorry. I'm like, no, focus on what you're focused on. That's okay. I understand. You're not trying to be mean to me. I get it. and like you're like you have 80 years of ingrained stuff in your brain. Like I sometimes struggle with saying, like I use they them pronouns. I struggle sometimes using they them pronouns now and then because my brain wasn't wired, wasn't like taught that way, and so like there's some just like stuff I'm still need to like break through. And so John was just like this really wonderful guy, and I just adored him so much. And it's just like no trans person is gonna jump down your throat because you misgendered them on accident. Like, and if they do, they're being a bit ridiculous. I mean, I understand people being like having a bad day and being like, fuck you, like stop misgendering. Like there's some trans people who just have like done with it and be like, fuck you, I like stop. But like 99% of the time, trans people will literally just go by intent. It's like if you are being transphobic and you're misgendering people because you're actively you're actively choosing to not care about us and just like, I'm going to use whatever pronoun I want for my comfortability. Then they'll call you transphobic. And if you're just intentionally misgendering, going out of your way to misgender, then you're just being an asshole. So like, no one is worried about that. Like no trans person is like, if your intent is to care about us, to see us, no one's going to be worried about it. And like, that's the same thing that Ross is pointing to here, this right-wing fear of like, if I say the wrong thing, kids are going to explode at me and like say I'm transphobic and run away from me. It's all of this stuff. And really what it comes down to is right-wing people, or these people who have transphobic attitudes, not being willing to like allow themselves to be uncomfortable in a moment to care for someone else. That's really all it comes down to. It's having not empathy for someone else and not willing to see them at every single point. 255 AD. He was not mistaking me for a man. He was just calling me sir, but he would just say sir as like a thing. I think he was even just recognizing my authority, for lack of a better word, as a director. But then he would say that it's just like, yes sir, and then he would be like, ah shit, like I that's a masculinizing term. So it's like, again, I didn't even see it like sir, whatever. It's fine. It's like, yes, there's some masculine assumption behind it, but like whatever. It's a gender neutral word we could use it as. But it was just his like being like, oh, I didn't mean to hurt you. It was like him being upset was because he didn't want to hurt my feelings. And I'm like, you don't need to worry about it, man. It's cool. I get it. So.
Yeah, so I would say what I want is space for parents and children and doctors to have these conversations, not for that child to express a transgender identity and then go get hormones the next day. Not at all.
Yeah, this is exactly what we were just talking about.
I do think it's really damaging when you have the government coming in and saying we're cutting off this intervention.
And that's actually an argument that a right-wing person should understand, right? Which, again, shows their hypocrisy. It's like, we want the government out of, like, dictating what care we get. Which is, you know, right-wing people's like, we want small government. They don't actually want small government. They want the government to reinforce what they actually want. So it's a hypocrisy. Not that pointing out the hypocrisy of, you know, bad faith fascist actors is ever going to work. Because for them, it's actually not hypocrisy. Their arguments are like, their words are their hypocrisy. Their brains are not seeing it as hypocrisy because they really just want people to assert their norms.
Studying it, we're not putting in safeguards.
It's why, by the way, I don't like Jon Stewart. Like, I appreciate Jon Stewart to some degree, but it's like stuff like Jon Stewart I don't think is helpful in any way, because what Jon Stewart does is just to go around all day pointing out the hypocrisy of right-wing assholes. And I'm just like, we can see it as hypocrisy. Like, said this thing, just at the end of the day, though, the people in power they know it's hypocrisy, they don't care, they're doing bad faith actors. And to the people that they're propagandizing to, they don't see it as hypocrisy, because what it's really about for them is asserting the type of way they think everyone should be living by. So they may understand, like, these 2 points don't confer with each other, but they don't see it as hypocrisy, because to them, it's not. It's all aligning under the same thing.
Virginia took a very different approach at first. So we had a law in West Virginia that said we're going to provide more oversight. That's one of the ways that we as legislatures regulate medicine, is to identify a problem, overprescription of opioids, but lack of informed consent for gastric bypass, all of this for minors as well. We're not going to ban those procedures, but we are going to require...
Yeah, I mean, Dead Pants 182, like, to be clear, like, when I do the thing, like, if people are actively not doing the work to try to fix their being misgendered, then yes, you have every right to be annoyed. What I'm saying is what right-wing people are worried about is like, oh, if I get one pronoun wrong, then you're going to come drip down my throat. And usually what it is they're repeatedly misgendering and worrying about their own comfort over, like, caring about someone else. Like, I'm not going to change, you know, like, yes.
stringent informed consent requirements, additional doctor's notes, assessments. And that's what West Virginia said. They said you need 2 independent assessments as a minor before you can have access to these medication, and then put in place a very particular informed consent requirement. And nobody challenged that law. People followed that law.
Do you think that law addressed a real problem with sort of clinics moving too quickly? Do you think there were clinics that moved too quickly?
And here, you already see exactly what Ross is trying to do here. I would argue that the 2 gender, like the needing to get 2 assessments is also a little bit of gatekeeping. Not everyone can afford two assessments. It costs money to get 2 assessments. So like, there's an argument about where the line is there, but it is one of those, like, you know, Chase is like trying to make this concession of like, there are already gatekeeping things. There are already things in place to prevent people from like accidentally, you know, getting hormone therapy if they're not ready for it, right? Like that's what Chase is acquiescing to in this point. But Ross is trying to move the goalpost here, right? He's like, well, all right, you admit that law on the book for getting assessments was like a way to curtail people going too quickly. So are you conceding that people are moving too quickly and getting hormones in there? Are you conceding the point that like people shouldn't be getting on hormones very, very quickly? That's a thing that's actually happening by saying that we need to get these assessments. And to be clear, like there are some places where people go on hormones when they should not have, but that's an argument for better understanding of trans healthcare rather than not. It's the whole thing about the detransitioner argument, right? Like people will argue like, Bill, people detransition from being trans and it's hard, like they got harmed and the right wing like bullshit propaganda narrative and like certain detransitioners who are being paid to push this narrative. Most detransitioners are still supportive of trans people, and actually a lot of detransitioners are like detransitioned for social reasons, not necessarily for any medical reasons, whatever. Anywho, long story short, like that argument around detransition means we should have better healthcare for trans people. If you outright ban it, people will not be getting like help from doctors. They'll try and get hormones on the DL, like stuff like that, without like actual doctors there. And actually, a lot of people who won't have access to healthcare will be harmed. But at the end of the day, like the people who are detransitioners should have had access to better doctors who were able to, you know, check and like make sure they were going through and making sure that this was right for them at the end of the day. And then sometimes in every single medical care, like there are going to be people where the medical care is wrong or bad. Like it doesn't, like there's more regret rates for just plastic surgery than there are for gender affirming care surgeries, right? So like there's always going to be some level of like cases where, you know, things went badly or things went wrong or, you know, whatever have you.
From diagnosis to prescription?
Well, so I don't necessarily think that the existing safeguards that we have for medical malpractice and other oversights weren't enough. But I think, as in all of medicine, that absolutely there are probably examples where things were prescribed without the oversight needed, that things were moving too fast in some places. I will say, I've seen that in aspects of my child's medical care outside this context. Yes,
exactly.
So we can sort of
informed consent is more than sufficient to let people make choices
about how serious it is here as opposed to other contexts. But I certainly don't think that the problems with medicine in this country, that gender affirming care, that medical care for gender dysphoria, was immune from those problems. And if a legislature had concerns and documented evidence of that, I think that is an appropriate solution to those set of concerns. Not saying we're going to ban the care, we're going to cut off your treatment, because I think that's really, really different than what legislatures usually do when they have a concern about overprescription, lack of assessments. There are other mechanisms that the law has, short of a categorical ban.
Yes,
right.
Exactly.
But in part, I think
Ross is going to drag it back.
Legislative responses. One, they're in a certain kind of continuity with shifts in Western Europe, which is not sort of
they don't
particularly religious or Republican territory, let's say, right? But you have a number of European countries that have sort of taken steps.
You mean
to
the
impose
UK
sort of
that is also
much
doing this bullshit
regulations
nonsense
on the use
that
of some
you're
of these practices
regurgitating
and protocols.
Is what he's
but
kind
then
of referring to.
The other background here, right? And American politics is always operating in this space of sort of backlash, overreach.
And here's where he's going to get into
the narrative that I heard from.
This is where he's going to get into trans activists went too far. Oop.
Transgender activists in, again, like 2019 to 2023 and so on, was often like not just, there is some discrete number of children who need this kind of care and we want to make sure they get it. The narrative was often people who say that most children who express some kind of gender dysphoria ultimately desist and become reconciled to their natal sex. That's transphobia. That was
So again, he's going, the like trans activist went too far. It's like, oh, you were saying it's transphobia if I acknowledge that some people wanted to identify as their natal sex after they go through like trans healthcare. Like, this is, again, not the argument that any trans person was making. We were like, trans people were arguing that you should allow people to explore their own gender identity at whatever level makes sense based on their own doctor recommendation. But like, it does not, like, you should be able to explore it. No one was saying it's transphobia if you acknowledge that some kids choose to, like, might explore their gender identity and may choose not to at the end of the day. But this is the, like, right-wing argument, again, that he is normalizing within the New York Times space and this, like, centrist moderate space.
Pretty clear line of argument that was used in specific cases.
It's a bullshit right-wing tactic that did not actually happen that is used to frame trans people as ridiculous.
Specific practices and doctors who were themselves arguing that lots of teenagers who experience dysphoria
but some people were mean to me online is exactly the argument that he's saying.
With some kind of treatment that tries to reconcile them rather than a treatment that interrupts puberty and so on. Would you agree that that argument existed and had...
Would you agree that this made-up thing that I said actually existed? Would you agree? And then Chase is going to say no. And then he's gonna be like, "Aha, well, fuck you."
Still
like
has
it's
real
just
potency.
It's making, again, framing this like trans person as like, you're not seeing, like, he's framing like this definitely happened. Chase is gonna say it didn't, or like do some level of acquiescing to him. And then either way he gets to win because he's already positioned it, and now the trans person is on the defense, right?
Well, so
like, by even presenting this argument, right? No matter what Chase says in this situation, he wins because he has already normalized it as a topic. And now we're debating whether or not it was a real thing that happened. So if Chase says no, that becomes the debate. And if Chase says, yes, maybe that happened somewhere, but it's not really real, then you already acquiesced. You've already given him some space.
I will say, just for myself, and I am very hesitant to announce things as transphobic.
He does love making up issues to get mad about, which is, again, the right-wing thing.
And that's where I am right now.
That's where you're here right now.
I'm here with you. Because I want to understand.
Chase is just basically like, I'm trying to have a normal conversation, man.
Anxieties are. I want to find.
Chase put himself in this position. So it's like, it's his fault that he's here. But, like, I have some level of, like, I'm so sorry, man, because you were, like, dealing with some bullshit, and, like, I can't.
Places where
you have the
we
patience
might
of a
agree.
saint, and I don't necessarily think that's a good thing in this case, but, like, you do have the patience of a saint.
There is a lot of confusion about some of the science related to gender nonconforming young kids, what happens at puberty. So I agree that there are a lot of young people who express gender nonconforming expressions, behaviors, who are not trans, who will never be trans. I mean, so I'm not a doctor, and I do think
that's okay. Neither am I.
That we have to.
I have some.
So then why are you having this conversation, Ross?
Strong medical opinions, notwithstanding.
He just literally even says it. He just says it jokingly out loud. It's like, neither of us are doctors, but I have strong medical opinions anyways. So you're just admitting you're speaking out your ass on these issues.
Yes, as do I.
Oh my God.
But I am trying to limit my expertise to where it's warranted.
Shade from Chase right there. It's like, I'm trying to limit my, like, he's saying it in a nice way, but he's like, I'm trying to limit my expertise to where it's warranted. There was shade.
But
there
I
was
do
such
trust
shade there.
Child and adolescent psychiatrists to assess based on existing diagnostic criteria. And so a child who is persistently and consistently for years saying they are a girl versus a child who paints their nails and wears dresses and in other ways is gender nonconforming, assuming both these children are assigned male at birth, I think there is a difference. I think that child and adolescent psychiatrists assess these differences, talk to the parents, and then the question is, after the onset of puberty, is there a distress that is prompted for those children with those consistent and persistent identifications that are different from their sex assigned at birth? I do not want a parent to feel like they can't have a conversation with members of their community or trans adults or doctors without being afraid of being called transphobic. And that is something I feel really strongly about. Like, I want us to be in a space.
Like, yes, he is correct. Like, you don't want people to be called transphobic around having these conversations. But again, it's like, it's still acquiescing to this framing of this is a thing that happens all the time. You know, that Ross is trying to present.
Maybe I've grown in this area, especially as a parent, to say, the last thing I want is for people to feel like they can't ask questions. So I, at least in my life, am very committed to the asking of questions, the safe spaces for asking questions. Mm-hmm. Maybe it doesn't have to just be to you. Maybe some of us can open our ways of engaging.
But again, and this is the problem, right? Like, yes, we should have safe spaces for people to ask questions. And that's what I want parents to have access to. I want, especially even more importantly, the trans kids to, or any kid, trans or not, to have access to, right? But you're in here with Ross, who has very clearly got some level of an agenda here to try to position, like, here are my legitimate concerns while normalizing right-wing rhetoric. And this is kind of ultimately where I want to come down. I'm going to have to end up soon because I have to go feed my cat, so I might end the stream a little bit before we finish this off. But this is kind of really where I wanted to get to. On this point is you can clearly see the corner that Chase has kind of been backed into. I feel bad for having Chase on that picture. Like, Chase has been backed into this corner about, like, having to argue with Ross. And it's like, at the end of the day, the big thing that I want to come across here, and we'll go a little bit longer, but it's like, we can tell Ross was transphobic because of his words and actions, right? At the end of the day, like, we should not be engaging with something like the New York Times, right? Like, I get the desire to, like, come on these programs and trying to be like, all right, I'll have this mainstream argument. I get where Chase is trying to come from here of, like, this is a big organization. I have a platform. I can try and have this conversation, right? And again, even as someone like Chase, who I respect quite a lot, like, he is not a Sarah McBride, right? I've said this earlier on in the stream, but, like, Sarah McBride is someone who should be setting the standard of, like, this is what we argue for trans rights on. And maybe she'll have to compromise on some legislation, but she should make clear the point of what we are fighting for. But she is already compromising ahead of time, saying, I need to do what, the popular opinion is, which is always going to lean more and more transphobic. So she should be setting the standard there. Whereas Chase, I have more respect for in that, like, he is trying to fight for material changes and material benefits for trans people under the law, within the law framework. So he has a much different job than Sarah McBride. And so I have a lot of respect for him, but him ultimately trying to take that energy of, like, I need to try to explain this in a legal framework, to try to take that energy into something like the New York Times, which is going to twist these assumptions of what the law is into then being used to try to frame trans, like, activism and, like, actually standing for what trans people want as ridiculous because, look, it doesn't fit our legal framework and our understanding of what trans people are. Like, he is going to use that against us. And so it is using the logic of the institution to try to fight for something that was never built to include us. Like, trans people were not, like, the institution of American law, the institution of American government, all of these things were never built to include transgender people within their framework. And so we are trying to ad hoc trying to defend trans rights within them and include trans rights within them. But at the end of the day, there are certain assumptions here that are going to constantly be wielded against trans people that are ingrained and seen as natural, that people do not, like, look at and do not want to look at, do not want to question, that being trans just as a thing are going to call into question. And as a result, it's going to continually normalizing anti-trans bigotry. And that's the project that someone like Ross is clearly engaging in. So, at the end of the day, like, Chase is trying to go into this with good faith. Ross is clearly not. And Ross is clearly, even if he thinks he's trying to be this, like, normative voice, he is presenting these transphobic arguments and saying they're even his opinion. But, like, he is presenting them and forcing Chase to argue them back. And he's not being a good interviewer in the sense that he is trying to enable Chase to, like share their point of view or his point of view. But trying to force Chase to, like, argue back on his points, so that Chase, he is not able to actually get his own points across, right? So, at
the same time, when I think about the law, which is what I am focused on every day in my life, for a lot of these questions, there are just basic legal principles that I still think should apply. I still think that we should have a check on the government's intrusion into our family decision-making. I still think that the
There
equal
was
protection
one moment
clause
that I want to
should
make sure we
apply
get to,
everyone.
where like there was one moment that I wanted to get to here near the end before we wrap out the stream, where like Ross seems to have this like gotcha moment. But I want to see if we can get to it before I have to go feed my cats.
I'm not
they're
someone
be
who
hungry
is
in about
out
15
there
minutes.
making policy. I'm someone who's looking at the laws that are being proposed that do exist and assessing whether or not they are violating our Constitution and civil rights statutes.
All right, I have to ask you about the specific case
Oh
of
God,
sports.
getting into sports.
And
I
then
think this might be.
We can go back to the bigger picture to finish up, because sports are a slightly different case where it's not so much parents worrying about.
Even says social contagion
a
right
sort
there.
of social contagion effect.
He's clearly
around
pushing the Abigail
gender
Shrier
identity. It's
bullshit.
parents
social
worrying
contagion.
about basic.
The fact that he has that
unfairness
word on
in
hand tells me everything.
And
all right, I'm going to pause
again,
here
sort of-
because, like, there is a gotcha moment that Ross tries to get into, and I forgot we was in the sports section. Sports is its own whole thing that I touched upon earlier in the stream, but it's a whole other argument that is gonna make me lose my shit. If we go too much further, and we're gonna be talking here for another like 10 hours if I get into it. Yeah. So yeah, at the end of the day, like Ross, basically, let me just get here. So. Yeah, end of the day, and the reason I wanted to share that, and there's a little bit more I wanted to get into, but at the end of the day, what I really wanted to get across is kind of dive into that interview. The reason I wanted to share is, number one, just vent my frustration with the whole thing, but I think what is particularly interesting about it, and I think is something to be kind of aware of as we look at like where the conversation is in the mainstream, is again, Ross himself is presenting as a conservative. He is a conservative, but he is one of those like trying to be a centrist moderate voice. And what I want to kind of warn everybody that I am very concerned about and very worried about is what we're going to be moving into. Because it is, again, a thing that we have seen repeated throughout kind of history in terms of like how fascism and liberalism sort of work in conjunction, is we are going to see a further push in the next few years under the Trump administration to further push anti-trans narratives. And we are going to see people like Gavin Newsom, people like Ezra Klein, people like Ross in the sort of conservative space who are seeming like, oh, we're just more normal conservatives. Gavin Newsom, I think, Pete Buttigieg is another example of this, of like pushing the line forward on anti-trans issues. And then when we reassert these liberal norms of like, look, we beat Trump. Fascism's done. These people, look, their coalition's falling apart. They're all crazy because fascism will be defeated at the end of the day. But you then have these people come into power that now take this like, all right, well, now the fascists are gone. We're going, and sorry, Heart too. Thank you so much. I adore you. Now the fascists are gone. Now we are going to like, now we can focus on, the things we really want to do for this country. Family. And the heteronormative family that we want to defend. Meanwhile, trans people are dead, trans people are pushed out, trans people have moved out of the country, immigrants have been rounded up, immigrants have been pushed out of the country. We have made this country more Christian, we have made this country more white, we have made this country more heteronormative, and push that further and further and further. And so, the inheritors of post-fascism will now inherit a world and a country that is much more white and much more steeped in these norms. And they will be able to say, we're being inclusive, we're fighting back against these things, but now we have pushed the line into being a much more like authoritarian, assimilatory, hegemonic culture. And that's ultimately the function of a fascist culture, like fascism, really, at the end of the day. Like, fascism is bad. Obviously, fuck fascism, we need to be fighting against fascism. Like, fuck it. But there is a symbiotic relationship here that I really want to worry people about. Like, yes, we need to be going out. We need to fighting against ICE, stand up against ICE, stand up for Palestinians, stand up for all these, like, do all of these things. These are very important things that we need to be working on. But we also need to be fighting for something else, which is fighting for building up our communities, building up our coalitions, building up with each other, something in defiance against these people. Because ultimately they're going to try to assert these norms.